I came home early and heard heavy breathing coming from my bedroom. As I reached for the door handle, my maid grabbed my arm and shouted, "Madame, do not open it. Call the police right this second." The raw terror in her eyes made my blood run cold. I was absolutely certain my husband was cheating on me. But when I finally forced that door open, what I saw was far more twisted than any affair. I heard a voice inside that room that should not have been there, and it belonged to the very last person I ever expected. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old. Up until that rainy Tuesday afternoon, I genuinely believed I had built a perfect, impenetrable life. I am a forensic accountant by trade. My entire career is built on finding hidden truths, tracking missing money, and exposing liars. Ironically, I was completely blind to the massive deception happening under my own roof. Years ago, I gave up a fast-track corporate career at a prestigious national firm to manage the books for my husband Greg's boutique wealth management company. Greg is 35, impossibly charismatic, and always seemed like the perfect partner. We had a beautiful home, a comfortable routine, and a solid foundation built on mutual trust, or so I thought. As I stood frozen outside my bedroom door, listening to the heavy breathing and violent thuds echoing from within my mind, raced through every sacrifice I had ever made. I had spent the last decade making myself small so everyone else could shine. I managed Greg's entire financial backend, working 80-hour weeks behind the scenes so he could be the brilliant, stress-free face of his firm. But my sacrifices did not stop with my husband. I had spent 10 years quietly funding my mother Beverly's lavish lifestyle. I paid her $3,000 monthly mortgage for a luxury condo in Florida. I covered her credit card bills without asking questions. I even bailed my younger sister Chloe out of $40,000 in student loans and designer debt. I did it all without complaint, believing that my endless financial support bought me genuine family love. I believed that being the reliable one, the provider, made me indispensable. I thought they loved me. I thought Greg loved me. I was supposed to be in Chicago for a 3-day conference on financial compliance. But the seminar ended early, and I caught a morning flight back to Seattle, hoping to surprise my husband. I took a cab from the airport, unlocked the front door quietly, and stepped into the foyer. The house was dead quiet at first. Then I heard it. A heavy, rhythmic thudding echoing from the second floor. A low grunt, followed by another violent smash. It sounded like someone was wrestling with a heavy piece of furniture. And then came the panting. Loud, breathless, desperate panting. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze at the base of the stairs, my suitcase slipping from my grip and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Greg was supposed to be at the office. He had told me he had back-to-back client meetings all afternoon, but that was definitely his voice groaning with physical exertion. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. I stood there paralyzed by the sudden suffocating realization that another woman was in my bed. The betrayal burned in my throat. Every late night at the office, every supposed business trip, every time he checked his phone and quickly locked the screen flashed through my mind. The thudding grew louder as I crept up the carpeted stairs. It was coming from the master suite at the end of the long hallway. I walked toward it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely feel my fingertips. I was 10 feet away when a hand suddenly clamped down on my wrist. I jumped, biting back a scream. It was Sarah, my loyal housekeeper. She had been with me for 3 years, and she was always impeccably composed, a quiet presence who kept our lives running smoothly. But right now her face was ashen. She was trembling from head to toe. She pulled me back toward the staircase, her voice a frantic, breathless whisper. "Madam, do not open it." She pulled her phone from her apron pocket, her fingers slipping on the screen. "Call the police right this second. They have been at it for an hour." I stared at her, completely disoriented by her panic. "Who has been at it, Sarah?" I asked, my voice cracking. I thought she meant Greg and some mistress. I thought she was trying to spare me the indignity and trauma of catching my husband in the act. But Sarah just shook her head, tears welling in her terrified eyes, and dialed 911. She pressed the phone to her ear and pulled me backward again. I did not wait for her to explain. The anger burning in my chest overrode my fear. I marched down the hallway, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. The sounds from behind the heavy oak door were unmistakable now. The harsh scrape of metal, the splintering of wood, more heavy panting. I grabbed the brass handle and twisted it hard. It was locked from the inside. "Greg," I screamed, pounding my fists against the solid wood. "Open this door right now." The noises inside stopped instantly. Total suffocating silence fell over the bedroom. "Open the door." I yelled again, my voice echoing through the massive house. I could hear Sarah in the background, frantically giving the emergency dispatcher our address, begging them to send officers quickly. Inside the room, heavy footsteps scrambled across the floor. Someone cursed loudly. It was Greg. I took a step back, raised my foot, and kicked the door right next to the lock. The wood splintered. I kicked it again with everything I had, channeling every ounce of shock and fury into my leg. The door frame cracked, the lock gave way, and the heavy door swung inward, crashing violently against the drywall. I stepped into the room, my chest heaving, fully prepared to confront a half-naked woman hiding in my bed. Instead, the sight before me made my brain short-circuit. My beautiful, meticulously decorated master bedroom looked like a literal war zone. The custom oak floorboards had been ripped apart and completely destroyed. Jagged shards of expensive wood were scattered across the Persian rug. The heavy king-sized bed had been shoved violently against the far wall, the mattress overturned and the frame gouged. But the destruction was not the most shocking part. Standing in the center of the ruined floor covered in sweat and grey sawdust was my husband Greg. He was holding a massive steel sledgehammer, his chest heaving, his expensive dress shirt soaked through. And standing right next to him, gripping a heavy iron crowbar and gasping for air, was my mother, Beverly, the woman who was supposed to be 3,000 miles away in Florida, living in the luxury condo I paid for every single month. For a long moment, nobody moved. We just stared at each other across the wreckage of my bedroom. My mother's face was flushed dark red, her designer blouse covered in dust and wood chips. Greg looked like a deer caught in headlights, his jaw hanging open, his hands gripped tightly around the handle of the sledgehammer. They were not having an affair. They were actively demolishing my house. I looked down at the gaping hole they had smashed into the floor. Beneath the shattered oak and torn subflooring, a dull grey metal box was exposed. It was my grandfather's hidden floor safe. My grandfather had passed away 2 years ago. He was a shrewd, self-made businessman and the only person in my family who truly saw me. He recognized my intelligence and frequently warned me about my mother's boundless greed and my sister's entitlement. Before he died, he left me that hidden floor safe. It contained his most valuable assets, untraceable bearer bonds, antique gold coins, and rare family heirlooms. He made absolutely sure the legal paperwork stated it belonged solely to me, completely untouchable by Greg Beverly or anyone else. It was my private inheritance, my ultimate safety net. Only Greg knew it existed because he was my husband, the man I trusted with my life. And now the two people I trusted most in the world were physically destroying my home to steal it from me. My mother recovered from the shock first. The panic in her eyes instantly morphed into vicious, unadulterated anger. She dropped the iron crowbar with a loud, ringing clang. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, stepping over the broken floorboards toward me. Her voice was sharp and accusatory, completely devoid of any guilt. "You are supposed to be in Chicago." I could barely form words. My mind was struggling to process the sheer absurdity and horror of the scene. "You are trying to rob me," I whispered, my voice trembling as the reality settled over me. "You are breaking into my grandfather's safe." Beverly's face twisted into an ugly snarl. She did not apologize. She did not try to explain or beg for forgiveness. Instead, she turned back to my husband. "Hurry up, Greg!" she screamed, pointing wildly at the exposed metal box embedded in the floor. "Smash it open before that ungrateful brat does anything. Get the grinder. We need what is inside that safe right now." Greg blinked, shaking his head as if trying to snap out of a trance. He looked at me, then at the safe, then at my mother. The charming, polished financial broker I had married was gone. In his place was a desperate, sweating stranger. He tightened his grip on the sledgehammer and took a step toward the safe. "Greg, do not do this," I warned, my voice finally finding its strength. "Sarah called the police. They are on their way. If you hit that safe one more time, you will leave this house in handcuffs." He hesitated, the sledgehammer hovering in the air. But my mother grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. "Do not listen to her," Beverly spat, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it took my breath away. "She is bluffing. She would never arrest her own husband and mother. Break the lock, Greg. We are out of time." I stood my ground in the doorway, blocking their only exit. My forensic accountant brain, trained to remain clinical in the face of chaos, finally kicked in. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a desperate act. People do not wield sledgehammers in their own homes unless they are backed into a corner. Why did they need the contents of my grandfather's safe so badly that they were willing to destroy my house and risk prison? What kind of financial hole was my husband in? And why was my mother, the woman whose entire life I financed, helping him dig out of it? As the red and blue lights began flashing through the bedroom window, painting the dust-filled air in erratic colors, I stared at Greg's trembling hands. The polished Rolex watch I had bought him for our 3rd anniversary was covered in drywall dust. His custom-tailored trousers were ruined. This was a man who obsessed over appearances, a man who built an entire wealth management firm on the illusion of impeccable control and elite stability. For him to resort to physical labor, tearing apart hardwood floors like a common thief, meant his carefully constructed world was collapsing. My mind rapidly catalogued the anomalies of the past few months. Greg had been increasingly irritable. He had started taking private phone calls in the garage. He had asked me on 3 separate occasions to sign over the equity of this very house to inject liquidity into his firm, claiming it was just a temporary measure for a massive upcoming real estate acquisition. I had refused every time, trusting my financial instincts over his smooth assurances. I had told him that mixing our personal sanctuary with his corporate liabilities was a terrible business strategy. He had smiled, kissed my forehead, and told me I was right. He had played the understanding husband while secretly coordinating with my mother to bypass my consent entirely. And Beverly. My mother stood there breathing heavily, her eyes darting frantically from the window to the safe. She had always viewed my success not as an achievement to be proud of, but as a resource to be tapped. When I bought her that Florida condo, she did not say thank you. She complained that the kitchen appliances were not stainless steel. When I paid off Chloe's debts, she told me it was my duty as the older, more fortunate sister. I had accepted the role of the family bank, confusing financial utility with familial affection. But looking at her now brandishing a crowbar like a weapon against her own daughter, I finally understood the fundamental truth of our relationship. To Beverly, I was not a daughter. I was an obstacle standing between her and a payday. They cannot arrest us in our own home, Greg muttered, his voice trembling as he lowered the sledgehammer. It is a civil matter. We can talk our way out of this, Clara. We can explain it to them. Explain what I fired back, my voice colder than ice. Explain that you coordinated with my mother to fly across the country, sneak into my house while you thought I was out of state, and demolish my bedroom to steal my grandfather's inheritance. How exactly does that fit into a civil dispute, Greg? You do not understand what is at stake here, Beverly snapped, taking a step toward me. Her tone was dripping with that familiar condescending authority she had used to control me since childhood. We are doing this for the family. Greg is in a difficult position. If you had just been a supportive wife and signed the house over when he asked, we would not have to resort to this. This is your fault, Clara. Your selfishness forced our hand. The sheer audacity of her statement hit me like a physical blow. She was blaming me for their attempted robbery. She had broken into my house, destroyed my property, and was now standing in the wreckage, demanding that I take responsibility for her crime. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, heavy-booted footsteps. Sarah was leading the officers straight to the master suite. The time for desperate excuses was over. I watched Greg drop the sledgehammer onto the ruined floor. He ran a hand through his dusty hair, took a deep breath, and his entire posture shifted. The panicked thief vanished, and the slick, confident wealth manager returned. He squared his shoulders, adjusted his ruined collar, and turned to face the door just as 2 uniformed police officers burst into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I felt a brief surge of relief. I thought this was the end. I thought the police would see the sledgehammers, the destroyed floor, the exposed safe, and the pure guilt written across my mother's face. I thought my husband and my mother would be led out in handcuffs, and I would finally be safe. But I was about to learn a terrifying lesson about how easily the truth can be twisted by someone who knows exactly how to manipulate the system. I thought the arrival of the police was my rescue. I had absolutely no idea that it was actually the beginning of the most calculated, devastating financial ambush of my life. The heavy footsteps in the hallway stopped, and two uniformed police officers stepped through the shattered doorway of my master bedroom. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over my trembling body. I actually let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. In my mind, the scene was undeniably clear and completely in my favor. My husband and my mother were standing amidst the violent wreckage of my custom oak floors, covered in drywall dust and sweat holding demolition tools. The hidden floor safe was exposed. It was a textbook crime scene. I pointed a shaking finger at Greg and Beverly. "Officer," I said, my voice tight with panic and adrenaline. "They are destroying my house. They are trying to break into my grandfather's safe to steal my inheritance. I want them arrested right now." I expected the officers to immediately draw their weapons, or at least shout commands. I expected them to put Greg and my mother against the wall and read them their rights. Instead, the older officer simply raised a hand, his eyes scanning the ruined room, the overturned mattress, the exposed metal safe, and finally resting on Greg. What I witnessed next was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. Greg dropped the heavy steel sledgehammer. It hit the ruined floorboards with a loud thud, and in that single second, his entire demeanor completely transformed. The desperate, sweating thief vanished into thin air. In his place stood the polished elite wealth manager I had married. He straightened his ruined collar, took a deep, calming breath, and walked toward the officers, with his hands visible and completely non-threatening. "Officer, I am so sorry you had to be called out here tonight," Greg said. His voice was incredibly calm, soothing and laced with the perfect amount of exhausted patience. He sounded exactly like a man dealing with a tragic, heavy burden. "There is absolutely no robbery happening here. This is our home. We are simply doing some emergency renovations on the subflooring due to severe water damage." I stared at him, utterly stunned by the smooth, flawless delivery of the lie. "Water damage!" I screamed, my voice echoing off the walls. "Look at the floor. You were trying to smash open my safe. You are lying." Greg turned to me, his eyes filled with a manufactured, pitying sadness that made my stomach physically turn. "Clara, sweetheart, please calm down," he said softly. "You are having another episode. The neighbors are going to hear you." Episode 1 snapped. I stepped toward the officers, my hands shaking. "He is lying to you. This is my house. The deed is strictly in my name. The safe belongs solely to me. You have to arrest him right now." The older officer frowned, looking back and forth between my frantic, disheveled state and Greg's calm, measured composure. "Sir, can you prove you reside here and have legal authorization to perform this work?" the officer asked. Greg nodded smoothly. "Of course, officer. I have the paperwork right here in my briefcase. My wife has been struggling with severe mental health issues lately. I try to keep the documentation handy for situations exactly like this." He walked over to his leather briefcase, which was sitting untouched on my dresser. He snapped the brass locks open and pulled out a thick manila folder. He handed a stack of official-looking papers directly to the officer. I stood there, paralyzed. Documentation? What documentation? The officer flipped through the heavy pages. "This is the deed to the property," Greg explained casually, pointing to the top document. "You will see, my name is clearly listed alongside hers as a joint owner. We have equal legal rights to modify the property however we see fit." My forensic accountant brain screamed at me. I lunged forward to look at the paper in the officer's hands. It was a copy of a property deed, and there, right next to my name, was Gregory Thomas. But that was legally impossible. I had purchased this house with my grandfather's trust money before Greg and I were even married. Greg's name was never on the deed. I had explicitly refused to add him to the title to protect my assets. "He forged that," I yelled, pointing wildly at the document. "That is a complete forgery. My grandfather made sure this house was solely mine. Check the county records. Check the notary stamp. He faked the entire document." Greg sighed heavily, rubbing his temples like a weary caregiver who had reached the end of his rope. He handed a second document to the officer. "And this officer is what breaks my heart to show you. It is a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation from her doctor. Clara was diagnosed with severe paranoid delusions and manic episodes 6 months ago. She imagines grand conspiracies. She thinks everyone is constantly trying to steal from her. We were just trying to fix the damaged floor while she was in Chicago, hoping to surprise her with the repairs, but she came home early and just snapped." I felt the room violently spinning. A psychiatric evaluation. I had never seen a psychiatrist in my entire life. I had never been diagnosed with paranoia or mania. Greg had fabricated an entire medical history complete with forged physician signatures and official-looking letterheads just to discredit me in my own home. He had planned this ambush. He had planned this down to the very last detail, knowing exactly what he would say and what documents he would produce if he ever got caught. I looked over at my mother, expecting her to finally step in. I expected her to have some tiny shred of maternal decency and stop this horrific life-destroying lie. Instead, Beverly stepped forward, tears streaming down her dust-covered cheeks. She clasped her hands together against her chest, playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken mother with sickening award-winning perfection. "It is true," Officer Beverly sobbed, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated fake emotion. "My poor daughter is very, very sick. We have been trying to get her help for months. She refuses to take her medication. She thinks Greg and I are out to ruin her life. We just came over to help Greg fix the house while she was away on a business trip, and she just attacked us. She's not in her right mind. Please, do not arrest her. She just needs to go to a hospital." I could not breathe. The walls of my own bedroom felt like they were rapidly closing in on me, crushing the air from my lungs. The two people I had sacrificed everything for, the husband whose business I had built from the ground up, and the mother whose luxurious lifestyle I had funded for a decade, were standing in front of armed law enforcement, labeling me dangerously insane to cover up their own crimes. It was a profound, suffocating violation of reality. They were expertly weaponizing the stigma of mental illness to render my truth completely invisible to the police. I looked at the officers. Their body language had completely changed. The tension had completely left their shoulders. They were no longer looking at Greg and Beverly as potential burglary suspects. They were looking at me as an unstable patient, a potential threat to myself and others. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking under the weight of the betrayal. "I am a forensic accountant. I manage multi-million-dollar portfolios for a living. I am perfectly sane. They are gaslighting you. They forged that deed to steal my inheritance. Look at the date on the signature. Look at the notary stamp. If you just let me get my computer, I can prove to you right now that the documentation is fraudulent." The younger officer stepped squarely between me and the exposed safe, holding up his hands in a firm, calming gesture. "Madame, I need you to take a deep breath and lower your voice right now," he said sternly. "Your husband has provided physical proof of residence and joint ownership. If you believe this deed is fraudulent, that is a matter for a civil court to decide. We cannot determine complex property disputes or verify notary stamps on the spot." "But they are destroying my property," I cried, pointing desperately at the shattered oak floorboards and the metal box sitting in the dust. The older officer shook his head, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "If your husband is on the deed, he has the legal right to rip up the floors. It is not a crime to demolish your own property, even if your spouse disagrees with it. As for the safe, if it is bolted to the foundation of a jointly owned home, it is considered a shared marital asset until a family court judge says otherwise. This is a civil domestic dispute, madam. There is absolutely no criminal activity happening here today. No criminal activity. They were staging a brazen high-stakes heist in broad daylight, using forged legal documents and entirely fake medical records, and the police were telling me it was a civil matter." Greg wrapped his arm around Beverly, comforting her as she continued to produce quiet, tragic tears. Officer Greg said softly, squeezing my mother's shoulder, "I can take it from here. I will call her primary care doctor immediately. We just want to get her the psychological help she so desperately needs. We do not want to press any charges for her kicking the door in and causing a disturbance." The older officer tipped his hat respectfully to Greg. "Good luck, sir. Madam, I strongly suggest you listen to your husband and seek medical attention. Have a quiet night." I stood frozen in the center of the wreckage as the two officers turned their backs on me and walked down the hallway. I could hear their heavy boots descending the wooden staircase. I could hear the front door open and close. The sharp click of the latch echoed through the silent house like a judge's gavel. The very second the front door shut, the atmosphere in the room violently snapped. The tragic, exhausted expressions on Greg and Beverly vanished instantly. The fake tears dried up. Greg dropped his comforting arm from my mother's shoulder and let out a sharp, incredibly cruel laugh. He looked at me, his eyes cold, calculating, and fully triumphant. Did you really think the cops would take the word of a hysterical, screaming woman over a calm, collected professional with official paperwork? Greg sneered, walking slowly toward me. I told you, Clara. You do not understand how the real world works. You only understand spreadsheets and tax codes. I understand that you are a criminal. I fired back, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. And I will expose every single forged document in that folder. You will rot in a federal prison for this, Greg. Both of you will. Before I could finish my sentence, Beverly lunged forward with terrifying speed. She grabbed my leather purse from my shoulder, ripping the strap violently down my arm. Give it back! I shouted, reaching for it. But Greg grabbed my arms from behind, pinning them tightly to my sides with bruising, undeniable force. He was much stronger than I was. I struggled wildly, kicking backward at his shins, but he held me in an iron grip. Beverly dug her manicured hands into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. She tapped the screen, verified it was locked, and slipped it directly into her own pocket. You are not exposing anything, Beverly hissed, stepping right into my face, her voice dripping with pure malice. You are a sick, paranoid woman who ran away from home during a severe manic episode. That is the story. That will always be the story. And without your phone, you cannot call your little lawyer friends to complain. Now get out of our house. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, the woman whose mortgage I paid every single month, realizing with absolute terrifying clarity that she would gladly destroy my life and lock me in an asylum just to secure her own financial comfort. Greg shoved me forward, forcing me out of the ruined bedroom and down the hallway. He did not let go of my arms. He frog marched me down the stairs. I stumbled, my knees banging painfully against the wooden steps, but he kept pushing me relentlessly toward the front door. You cannot do this, I yelled, my voice raw with terror and overwhelming rage. This is my house. You have no legal right to remove me. I have the deed. Clara? Greg laughed maliciously as we reached the foyer. As far as the state of Washington is concerned, I have every right to remove a trespasser. He grabbed the brass handle of the front door, yanked it open, and forcefully shoved me outside into the freezing evening. I stumbled across the threshold, my bare feet hitting the cold, wet concrete of the porch. It was pouring rain. The freezing Seattle downpour soaked through my thin silk blouse, instantly chilling me to the bone. I spun around just in time to see Greg standing in the doorway, staring down at me with a look of absolute, unvarnished disgust. Do not bother coming back, he said coldly, stepping back into the warm, dry foyer. We are changing the locks tonight, and if you try to break in, I will show the police that psychiatric evaluation again and have you committed to a mental ward for a mandatory 72-hour hold. Have a nice night, crazy. He slammed the heavy wooden door shut in my face. A second later, I heard the sharp, heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding securely into place. I ran to the door and pounded on it with my bare fist until my knuckles bled, screaming for them to let me in. The only answer was the sound of the freezing rain beating heavily against the porch roof. I stood on the porch, shivering uncontrollably, completely soaked, with no phone, no keys, and absolutely no shelter. The two people I loved most in the world had just orchestrated a flawless, malicious coup. They had successfully weaponized the law against me, stolen my home, and left me on the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. I walked for what felt like hours, though it might have only been 20 minutes. The freezing Seattle rain soaked through my silk blouse, plastering my hair to my face and sending violent shivers down my spine. Every step I took away from the house I owned felt like a physical tearing of my reality. I had no coat, no keys, and my mother had stolen my phone. All I had was my leather purse clamped tightly under my arm, protecting the only things I had left in the world, my wallet and my laptop. I finally saw the glowing neon sign of a 24-hour diner casting a harsh red light onto the wet pavement. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the bell jingling cheerfully above my head, a sound that felt entirely disconnected from the absolute nightmare I was living. The waitress behind the counter took one look at my dripping clothes, my smeared makeup, and my trembling hands. She did not ask any questions. She just pointed to a booth in the far back corner and quickly brought me a steaming mug of black coffee. I wrapped my freezing fingers around the thick ceramic mug, desperately trying to absorb its heat to stop my body from shaking. I needed to think. I needed to access my accounts before Greg could do any more damage. My forensic accountant brain, usually so calm and highly methodical, was fighting through thick, suffocating layers of shock and betrayal. I pulled my laptop from my purse, praying the rainwater had not seeped through the leather. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark corner of the booth. I connected to the diner's unsecured wireless network. My hands were shaking so severely that it took me 3 attempts to type my own banking passwords correctly. I logged into the primary joint savings account Greg and I shared. We had spent years building that account. It was supposed to be our safety net, our future, the foundation of the life we were building together. I watched the little loading icon spin on the screen, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs. When the page finally refreshed, my breath caught in my throat. The number staring back at me was 0. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, convinced it was a glitch in the connection or a temporary server error. I hit the refresh button again. 0. My chest tightened painfully as the reality washed over me. Over $350,000 money I had meticulously managed, saved and grown through careful investments, was completely gone. I quickly navigated to the transaction history, my eyes scanning the digital ledger. The entire balance had been wired to an unrecognizable offshore corporate account just 3 hours ago. Right around the exact time Greg had claimed he was sitting in back-to-back client meetings downtown. He had drained our entire life savings while I was sitting on a flight home. Panic began to claw fiercely at my throat. I clicked over to my personal checking account, the one I kept strictly in my name. It was the account I used to pay for my mother's luxury condo mortgage in Florida and my sister's endless stream of debts. Empty. He had cleared that out too. A sudden terrifying thought hit me. I reached into my purse and pulled out my primary credit card. I waved the waitress over and asked her to run it to pay for the coffee just to test it. She gave me a sympathetic nod and walked back to the register. A minute later, she returned holding the plastic card awkwardly between 2 fingers. "I am so sorry, honey," she said softly, looking at me with deep pity. It declined. I handed her a different card, a premium travel card I rarely used. Declined. Every single line of credit I had, every checking account, every financial asset my name was attached to had been systematically frozen, maxed out, or completely drained. Greg had not just locked me out of my physical house. He had financially erased me. He knew exactly what he was doing. Without money, I could not hire a high-powered attorney. Without credit, I could not book a hotel room to get out of the cold. Without my phone, I could not call the police or the bank fraud department to report the theft. He had left me utterly destitute on the street, supremely confident that a woman with absolutely no resources could never fight back against his elite wealth management firm. I dug frantically into the bottom of my purse and found a crumpled $20 bill. I handed it to the waitress, telling her to keep the change. I needed help. I needed an ally. I thought of my younger sister, Jessica. We had never been incredibly close, mostly because she spent her entire life mirroring my mother's deeply entitled behavior. But I had always been there for her. Just last year, I had paid off $40,000 of her mounting credit card debt, so she would not lose her apartment. I had paid for her expensive car repairs. I had funded her lavish birthday trips to Vegas. Surely she did not know the horrific extent of what Beverly and Greg were doing right now. Surely if she knew they had left me homeless and penniless in the pouring rain, she would help me. I asked the waitress if they had a landline I could use for a severe emergency. She pointed me to a dusty phone mounted on the wall near the restrooms. I dialed Jessica's number from memory, praying desperately that she would answer. The phone rang 4 times. Just as it was about to go to voicemail, I heard the line click open. "Hello, Jessica," said her voice, sounding slightly annoyed and distracted. "Jessica, it is?" "Clara." I said, my words rushing out in a frantic, desperate whisper. "Please do not hang up. Mom stole my phone. Greg and Mom just locked me out of my own house. They literally tore up my bedroom floors trying to break into Grandpa's safe, and Greg just drained every single cent from my bank accounts. I am stranded at a diner in the pouring rain. I need you to wire me enough money for a hotel tonight, or please come pick me up. I have absolutely nothing left." There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the other end of the line. I held my breath, waiting for her gasp of horror, waiting for her to ask if I was hurt, waiting for my sister to finally act like family. Instead, when Jessica finally spoke, her tone was not filled with concern. It was dripping with cold, mocking amusement. Mom told me you finally snapped, Jessica said, letting out a short, cruel laugh that echoed through the receiver. I felt the last remaining piece of my heart shatter into a million jagged pieces. What I choked out, gripping the plastic phone cord so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. Jessica, they are robbing me. They stole my money. You are not listening to me. Oh, I am listening, Clara? Jessica replied, her voice hardening into the exact same condescending superior tone my mother always used to belittle me. But honestly, you brought this entirely on yourself. You have always been so rigid, so suffocatingly controlling with your money. Greg is trying to build a massive financial empire for the family. If you had just signed the house equity over to Greg for his business like a good supportive wife, this would not have happened. You forced them to do things the hard way. I could not speak. The diner walls started spinning around me. The words echoed violently in my ears. For the family. She knew. Jessica knew everything. She knew about Greg's business troubles. She knew about the coordinated plan to forge the deed to my house. She knew they were going to ambush me, steal my grandfather's inheritance, and leave me on the street. My own sister, the woman whose life I had literally funded with my own hard-earned salary, was entirely complicit in my total destruction. You know, Jessica continued, sighing dramatically, as if I were a massive burden simply for surviving the night. You should really check yourself into a facility, Clara. Mom said the police even agreed that you need severe psychiatric help. Do not call me again until you are ready to apologize and act like a team player for this family. The line went dead. The harsh dial tone buzzed loudly against my ear, a mechanical sound that perfectly matched the hollow emptiness in my chest. I slowly placed the receiver back on the hook. I walked back to my booth, packed my laptop into my damp leather purse, and stepped back out into the freezing rain. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally complete, that I could not even cry. My tears had completely dried up, replaced by a cold, dark void in the very center of my chest. My husband had robbed me blind. My mother had physically attacked me, stolen my phone, and lied to the police. My sister had mocked my desperation and blamed me for my own calculated ruin. I had spent 10 years of my life sacrificing my own happiness, my own career progression, and my own financial security to build a perfect, comfortable life for people who viewed me as nothing more than a walking automated teller machine. They had consumed my resources until they felt entitled to take the rest by sheer force. I walked aimlessly down the wet, deserted sidewalk, shivering uncontrollably as the rain continued to pour down in heavy sheets. I had no family. I had no husband. I had no home. But as I walked through the dark city streets, the freezing numbness inside me began to solidify into something else entirely. Something incredibly hard, sharp, and unbreakable. I remembered Sarah, my loyal housekeeper. During the chaotic confrontation in the bedroom right before my mother violently snatched my purse, Sarah had slipped a small folded piece of paper into my coat pocket. I reached into my damp jacket with numb fingers and pulled it out. It was a local address and a landline phone number written in hurried ink. I walked another block until I found a brightly lit gas station. I used a stray quarter I found buried at the very bottom of my purse and dialed the number from the payphone outside. Sarah answered on the very first ring. "Madame," she whispered, her voice thick with genuine worry and relief. "Are you safe?" I told her exactly what had happened. I told her that my accounts were completely drained, my credit cards were frozen, and my family had completely abandoned me to the streets. "Stay right there," Sarah said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm coming to get you right now." 30 minutes later, Sarah pulled into the gas station parking lot in her beat-up older model sedan. I climbed into the passenger seat, soaking wet and trembling. She drove me to her tiny, cramped apartment, located in a rundown building on the far outskirts of the city. The contrast between my sprawling, custom-built, multi-million-dollar house and Sarah's modest single-bedroom home was incredibly stark. But as she unlocked the door, wrapped a warm, dry blanket around my shivering shoulders, and handed me a cup of hot chamomile tea, this tiny, drafty apartment felt infinitely safer than my mansion ever had. "You can stay on this couch for as long as you need to, madam," Sarah told me, sitting across from me, her eyes filled with deep, unwavering compassion. I saw what they did in that room. I heard what they said to the police. I know you are not crazy. I looked down at the steaming tea in my trembling hands. The woman I paid a modest salary to clean my floors was offering me absolute sanctuary, while the family I had given hundreds of thousands of dollars to had thrown me into the freezing rain. I lay down on Sarah's worn fabric couch that night, pulling the blanket all the way up to my chin. I stared at the faint water stains on the ceiling in the dark, listening to the rain tap against the thin glass of the window. I was currently entirely stripped of my wealth, my property, and my family. I had $20 to my name, but Greg, Beverly, and Jessica had made one massive fatal miscalculation when they decided to declare war on me. They forgot exactly who they were dealing with. They forgot that before I was a compliant, easygoing wife and a dutiful, generous daughter, I was a highly trained, ruthless forensic accountant. I knew exactly how to find hidden money. I knew how to track complex corporate fraud across international borders. And most importantly, I knew exactly how Greg's secure business systems worked, because I was the one who built the entire digital infrastructure from the ground up. As the rain battered against the small apartment window, my grief finally burned away completely, leaving absolutely nothing behind but pure, cold, and entirely focused determination. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over Seattle, and I would stop mourning the family I never really had. Tomorrow, I would begin systematically dismantling the lives of the people who tried to destroy mine. The cold morning air hit me the moment I stepped out of Sarah's apartment building. The Seattle sky was a bruised, heavy gray, perfectly matching the suffocating weight in my chest. I was wearing a pair of Sarah's faded sweatpants and a plain cotton t-shirt that hung loosely over my shoulders. My own clothes, the tailored silk blouse and slacks I had worn on my flight home, were still damp and ruined from being thrown into the freezing rain the night before. I had $20 to my name, a crumpled bill Sarah had practically forced into my hand before leaving for her morning shift. I had no credit cards, no phone, and no home. My husband Greg and my mother Beverly had orchestrated a flawless, brutal eviction from my own life. They had branded me insane, weaponized the police against me, and locked me out of the house my grandfather had left me. But as I walked toward the bus stop, my breath pluming in the crisp air, the overwhelming sorrow began to recede. It was replaced by a sharp, highly focused adrenaline. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days dissecting complex financial fraud, uncovering hidden assets, and exposing liars who thought they had covered their tracks. Greg and my mother had stolen my life, but I was not going to sit on the sidewalk and weep. I needed a paper trail. I needed to see exactly what they had done. At 10 minutes to 8, I stood outside the heavy glass doors of Pacific Northwest Standard Bank in downtown Seattle. I wrapped my damp trench coat tighter around myself, shivering as the wind whipped off the Puget Sound. I had managed all of Greg's corporate accounts and our joint personal accounts at this specific branch for over 6 years. The staff knew me. They respected my financial acumen. But standing there in borrowed oversized clothes with uncombed hair, I felt utterly exposed. When the security guard finally unlocked the doors at exactly 8 o'clock, I did not wait in the teller line. I walked straight past the velvet ropes and directly toward the glass-enclosed office of the branch manager, Robert Henderson. Robert was a seasoned banker in his late 50s. We had sat in this very office countless times to discuss investment yields and corporate credit lines. He looked up from his computer monitor as I pushed his door open. His eyes widened in absolute shock. "Clara," Robert said, standing up so quickly his heavy leather chair banged against the wall behind him. "Good Lord, what happened to you? Are you all right? You look like you have been through a war." I sat down in one of the plush client chairs across from his massive mahogany desk. I did not have the emotional bandwidth for small talk. "Robert," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady, "I need you to pull up my personal checking account and the joint savings account I share with Greg. I need to see the exact transaction history for the past 48 hours, and I need you to freeze all outgoing transfers immediately. My husband has drained our life savings, and he has locked me out of my own home." Robert's face fell. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair. His expression shifted from shocked concern to a deep professional discomfort that made my stomach drop. "Clara," he said gently, his voice carrying the careful, measured tone of a man delivering devastating news. "I received a phone call from Greg yesterday afternoon. He told me you were experiencing a severe medical emergency. He said you were suffering from a psychological crisis and were being moved to an inpatient facility for your own safety. He mentioned that he needed to secure the family assets to cover the immense medical costs and protect your shared business while you were incapacitated. I stared at him, the sheer horrifying scale of Greg's manipulation washing over me. Greg had not just lied to the police on a whim. He had laid the groundwork for this massive financial ambush hours before I even stepped off my flight from Chicago. He had weaponized a completely fabricated mental illness to seamlessly bypass any red flags the bank might have raised about sudden massive withdrawals. "I am perfectly sane, Robert," I said, leaning forward and placing my hands flat on the cool wood of his desk so he could see they were not shaking. "I am sitting right in front of you. I am not in a psychiatric facility. My husband and my mother forged a medical evaluation to steal my money and break into my grandfather's floor safe. You have known me for 6 years, Robert. I am a forensic accountant. Have I ever, in the entire time we have done business together, given you a single reason to believe I am mentally unstable?" Robert swallowed hard, looking deeply conflicted. He tapped his keyboard, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. The harsh light reflected in his wire-rimmed glasses. "Clara, you know I respect you, but the joint savings account was legally accessible by either party. Greg had full legal authorization to initiate those wire transfers. The entire balance was moved to an offshore holding company, registered in the Cayman Islands yesterday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Because it was a joint account, there is absolutely nothing the bank can do to reverse it without a federal court order." I closed my eyes, forcing myself to absorb the brutal impact of his words. $350,000. Gone. The money I had earned, the money I had meticulously saved and grown through careful investments, vanished into an untraceable offshore void. It was devastating, but I had already braced myself for that loss when I checked my accounts at the diner. I took a slow, deep breath and opened my eyes. "Fine," I said, my voice eerily calm. "The cash is gone, but the property on Mercer Island belongs entirely to me. I bought it with my grandfather's trust fund before Greg and I even got married. Greg is not on the title. I need to ensure that my property is safe." Robert went completely pale. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stopped typing and looked at me, a profound, terrible pity shining in his eyes. "Clara," he whispered, "I am so sorry." A cold, dark knot formed in the pit of my stomach. "Sorry for what, Robert? What did he do?" Robert reached for a thick stack of printed documents sitting on the corner of his desk. He pulled the top file off the stack and slowly slid it across the polished mahogany toward me. He did not say a word. He just let the paperwork speak for itself. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. My eyes frantically scanned the numbers on the page. The principal loan amount was $600,000. The collateral listed was my grandfather's house on Mercer Island. The funds had been fully approved, drawn to the absolute maximum limit, and wired to the exact same offshore account as my savings. "This is impossible," I gasped, my chest heaving, as pure panic finally broke through my carefully constructed composure. "I never applied for a loan. I never signed this. Greg is not on the deed. He cannot borrow against a house he does not own." "Look at the second page," Clara Roberts said quietly. I flipped the heavy legal paper over. There at the bottom of the page was a quitclaim deed. It legally transferred joint ownership of the house from me to Gregory Thomas. And right below that transfer clause was my signature. It was flawlessly executed. The familiar loop of the C, the sharp angle of the A. It looked exactly like my handwriting. Greg had spent years watching me sign tax returns and corporate audits. He had practiced my signature until he could replicate it perfectly. Below my forged signature was the final signature line for the massive home equity loan. By forging the quitclaim deed first, Greg had magically turned himself into a joint owner on paper, giving him the legal authority to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars against my property. He had extracted every single ounce of equity from the home my grandfather had built, and he had saddled me with a $600,000 debt I could never possibly repay. "I am going to lose the house," I whispered, the reality crashing down on me with the force of a falling building. "The bank will foreclose on my grandfather's house. I will be completely bankrupt." Robert nodded slowly, his expression grim and apologetic. "The paperwork is legally binding, Clara. The identification checks were completed. The signatures match our records perfectly. And most importantly, the documents were fully notarized by a state licensed official. As far as the bank is concerned, this is a completely legitimate authorized transaction. I cannot freeze the debt. I cannot reverse the transfer. You're going to need a very aggressive defense attorney, Clara. Because right now on paper, you owe this bank $600,000. I stared blindly at the forged documents, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears. They had destroyed me. My husband, the man who promised to protect me, and my mother, the woman who brought me into this world, had executed a flawless, malicious financial execution. They had stripped me of my past, my present, and my entire future. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to collapse onto the floor of that bank and just scream until my lungs gave out. I felt like a helpless, naive victim who had marched blindly into a slaughterhouse. But as the first tear spilled over my eyelashes and hit the polished mahogany desk, something shifted deep inside my brain. The hysterical, terrified wife disappeared. The dutiful, accommodating daughter vanished. The woman who sat in that leather chair was suddenly replaced by a hardened, calculating forensic accountant. I had spent my entire adult life hunting down corporate thieves, exposing embezzlement and tearing apart complex financial frauds. I knew that no crime is ever truly perfect. White-collar criminals always leave a trail. They always get arrogant. They always make one fatal mistake. I reached out and pulled the documents closer to my face. I stopped looking at the horrific sum of money. I stopped looking at my forged signature. I forced my eyes to focus strictly on the legal mechanics of the paperwork. I looked at the notary section. In the state of Washington, a forged signature on a real estate document means absolutely nothing unless a licensed notary public verifies the identity of the person signing it. The bank accepted this massive loan because a sworn official of the state had placed their legal stamp on the page, legally swearing under penalty of perjury that Clara Thomas had physically sat in front of them, presented a valid government identification, and signed the documents of her own free will. I stared at the bright red ink of the circular notary stamp pressed firmly onto the bottom right corner of the page. I read the name printed in the center of the seal. Todd Mitchell, commission expires August 2026. A harsh, entirely humorless laugh escaped my lips. Robert jumped slightly in his chair, startled by the sudden sound. Todd Mitchell, I said out loud, tapping my index finger hard against the red stamp. Todd Mitchell was Greg's sleazy, arrogant business partner. He was a man who wore too much cologne, drove a leased sports car he could barely afford, and had a well-known aggressively hidden gambling addiction. Greg and Todd had built their wealth management firm together. They were thick as thieves. Greg had obviously paid Todd, probably using a massive chunk of my stolen savings to illegally stamp the forged quitclaim deed and the loan documents. They thought they were absolute geniuses. They thought they had successfully bypassed the system by keeping the fraud entirely in-house. But looking at that bright red stamp, the sheer intoxicating thrill of an investigation began to hum through my veins. The overwhelming, suffocating panic faded into a cold, dark, calculated determination. I looked at the date and time written next to Todd's signature. The official notary log stated that the document was stamped and executed at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, just one day prior. I closed my eyes and pictured yesterday afternoon. At exactly 2:15, I was not sitting in Todd Mitchell's downtown Seattle office, signing away my grandfather's house. At 2:15 yesterday afternoon, I was walking through the TSA security checkpoint at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. I had scanned my digital boarding pass. I had stood inside the full body scanner. I had handed my driver's license directly to a federal transportation security officer. I had left an undeniable, federally verified, time-stamped digital and physical footprint in a completely different time zone. There was absolutely no physical or legal way I could have been in two places at once. The emotional fog completely lifted from my mind, replaced by a razor-sharp clarity that felt almost lethal. My mother and my husband thought they had buried me under a mountain of debt and forged paperwork. But by using Todd Mitchell to notarize the forgery, they had escalated their crime from a simple domestic dispute into a massive multi-tiered federal offense. They had committed wire fraud, bank fraud, and notary fraud. They had crossed a very distinct legal line, and I had the exact proof needed to completely destroy them. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I did not slouch. I did not tremble. I smoothed the wrinkles from my borrowed oversized t-shirt and looked Robert Henderson dead in the eye. "Can I get a physical copy of these documents, Robert?" I asked, my voice entirely steady, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who knew exactly how to win. Robert nodded quickly, printing a copy and handing it to me across the desk. "Clara, what are you going to do?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. "I am going to do my job, Robert," I replied, slipping the forged documents carefully into my leather purse. "I am going to follow the money." I turned and walked out of the branch manager's office. I strode across the marble floor of the bank lobby, my head held high. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped back out into the freezing, relentless Seattle rain. I was no longer shivering. The cold did not bother me anymore. I was no longer the tragic, betrayed wife crying on the street corner. I was no longer the helpless victim of my mother's boundless greed and my husband's vicious lies. I was the hunter now, and I knew exactly where to find the ammunition I needed to burn their entire empire to the ground. The rain had completely stopped by the time I made it back to Sarah's small apartment, leaving behind a damp, suffocating chill that settled deep into my bones. I sat alone at her cramped kitchen table, staring blankly at the scarred Formica surface. The forged home equity line of credit documents I had obtained from the bank earlier that morning lay spread out in front of me. They were a terrifying physical monument to my husband's absolute betrayal and my mother's boundless greed. $600,000 in fraudulent debt anchored directly to the house my grandfather had built, a house that was supposed to be my untouchable safe harbor. I was 33 years old, a highly trained forensic accountant who tracked missing millions for massive corporations, and I had been completely, utterly blindsided by the people sleeping under my own roof. But sitting in that quiet, drafty apartment, the paralyzing shock of the last 24 hours was finally beginning to curdle into a cold, highly calculated rage. I opened my damp leather purse and pulled out my laptop. I plugged the power cord into the wall outlet, praying desperately that the freezing rainwater from the night before had not seeped through the casing and fried the motherboard. The screen flickered momentarily, went completely black for a terrifying second, and then glowed to life, illuminating the dark kitchen. I breathed a heavy, shaky sigh of relief. This laptop was my only remaining weapon. Greg thought he had locked me out of everything. He thought he had successfully severed my access to our joint accounts, my credit cards, and my entire financial existence. But Greg was a deeply arrogant man, and arrogant men always overlook the quiet structural foundations that actually hold up their empires. 6 years ago, when Greg first launched his boutique wealth management firm, he did not have the upfront capital to hire a high-tier cybersecurity team. So I built his entire digital infrastructure myself. I set up the secure servers, configured the complex client databases, and established the intricate firewalls that protected his firm's daily operations. And because I was a naturally cautious forensic accountant, even back then, I quietly wrote a backdoor administrative code into the absolute deepest layer of the system architecture. It was an emergency override, a master key designed to grant full unrestricted access in case of a catastrophic server failure or a total system lockout. Greg never knew about it because he never cared to understand how the technology actually worked. He only cared about how wealthy and successful the firm made him look to his country club friends. I connected the laptop to Sarah's spotty internet router. The glowing screen cast a pale bluish light across my exhausted face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. What I was about to do was a severe federal crime. Accessing a highly secure financial server without authorization was a serious felony that could easily cost me my certified public accountant license and land me in a federal prison. But my husband and my mother had already stolen my entire life, forged my signature on federal banking documents, and actively tried to have me permanently committed to a psychiatric ward. The time for playing by the rules was completely over. I typed in the backdoor command sequence. A black terminal window popped up on my screen. I entered the old administrative credentials, holding my breath as the system processed the unauthorized request. The cursor blinked steadily on the dark screen. It felt like standing on the edge of a massive cliff in the pitch dark, waiting to see if the ground would crumble beneath my feet. If Greg had paid a professional to update the core server architecture in the last year, my old code would trigger an immediate security alert, notifying him of the digital breach. 5 agonizing seconds passed, then 10. Then a long, rapid list of encrypted server directories suddenly cascaded down my screen. I was in. I immediately bypassed the standard employee interfaces and the public-facing client portals. I dove straight into the hidden executive financial ledgers. This was the dark digital room where Greg hid the firm's true operational data, far away from the polished, heavily sanitized quarterly reports he confidently presented to his wealthy clients. My eyes scanned the complex spreadsheets, searching for the massive outflow of cash from our personal joint savings account. It took me less than 10 minutes to track the stolen money. The $350,000 he had drained from our personal savings had not just vanished into a random offshore account. It had been meticulously routed through a sophisticated web of dummy shell companies, eventually landing in a heavily obscured corporate holding account. And there, sitting brazenly in the digital transaction log, was a direct time-stamped wire transfer for $50,000. The designated recipient of that massive payout was Todd Mitchell, Greg's sleazy, gambling-addicted business partner, and the licensed state notary who had officially stamped my forged signature on the home equity loan. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. There it was. Absolute, undeniable digital proof of a highly coordinated financial crime. Greg had explicitly paid Todd $50,000 to permanently risk his notary license and illegally validate the forged quitclaim deed. It was a massive financial payoff for a massive federal crime. With this single ledger entry, I could easily march into the local police precinct, demand to speak with a financial crimes detective, and have both of them arrested for fraud before dinner time. I could clear my name and easily invalidate the horrific $600,000 debt they had dumped on my shoulders. I felt a sudden, powerful surge of adrenaline. I actually reached for my jacket, fully ready to march straight to the authorities and end this nightmare. But my extensive forensic training forced me to pause. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the overarching numbers staring back at me. I sat back down at the kitchen table and pulled up the master operating accounts for Greg's entire wealth management firm. As a seasoned accountant, I read numbers the exact same way other people read basic English sentences. And the story these specific spreadsheets were telling was absolutely terrifying. Greg's firm supposedly managed tens of millions of dollars for elite demanding clients across the Pacific Northwest. He routinely claimed to generate consistent double-digit returns through highly exclusive private real estate investments. But as I traced the massive flow of capital moving through his hidden operating accounts, I realized a horrifying truth. There were no real estate acquisitions. There were no commercial property portfolios. There were no actual, tangible investments generating any legitimate revenue whatsoever. The money was just moving in an endless, frantic, completely desperate circle. I clicked wildly through the transaction histories, my horror growing exponentially with every single line item I reviewed. When a new investor deposited $1 million into Greg's firm, Greg immediately sliced off a massive percentage of that cash for his own extravagant lifestyle. He bought custom-tailored suits, luxury cars, expensive dinners, and high-end country club memberships. The remaining balance of the new investor's money was then quickly shuffled around to pay the promised monthly dividends to older investors, keeping them completely satisfied and entirely unaware that their principal investments had already been spent. It was the textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme, a massive hollow house of cards built entirely on vicious lies, fake profit statements, and stolen capital. And according to the desperate, chaotic red numbers flashing across my computer screen, the entire criminal scheme was currently in the final catastrophic stages of a total collapse. Greg had simply run out of new investors to swindle. The monthly dividend payments he owed to his wealthy clients now vastly exceeded the incoming capital. He was drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt, and angry, powerful clients were undoubtedly beginning to demand their principal investments back. He was completely out of time and out of money. But that massive financial revelation still did not explain why my mother was standing in my master bedroom covered in drywall dust, gripping an iron crowbar. I dug much deeper into the highly encrypted client manifest, searching for any possible connection to Beverly. When I finally found her personal investment file, hidden deep inside a restricted subfolder, the sheer magnitude of her betrayal hit me so hard I physically gasped for air in the empty kitchen. My mother, the woman who constantly complained to me about her tight budget, the woman who happily allowed me to pay her luxury condo mortgage every single month for 10 years, had secretly possessed a massive retirement fund totaling nearly $800,000. She had hidden this immense wealth from me for over a decade, perfectly content to maliciously drain my hard-earned salary to fund her daily life while hoarding her own secret fortune. But her intense, bottomless greed had finally become her absolute downfall. 3 years ago, clearly seduced by Greg's slick promises of guaranteed massive wealth, Beverly had quietly transferred every single penny of her secret retirement fund directly into his fraudulent firm. She had willingly invested her entire life savings into a Ponzi scheme, and now that money was completely gone, vaporized to pay off other angry investors and fund Greg's lavish fake lifestyle. The twisted, sickening truth finally clicked into perfect place, fully illuminating the horrific, violent scene I had walked into yesterday afternoon. When the Ponzi scheme began to violently collapse a few weeks ago, my mother realized her entire $800,000 nest egg was completely gone. Instead of doing the right thing and turning Greg into the federal authorities, she had conspired with him. They desperately needed to find a massive immediate injection of cash to keep the fraudulent scheme afloat just long enough for them to escape the country or hide the remaining assets. And I was their ultimate unsuspecting target. They had forged my signature on the home equity line of credit, stealing $600,000 in cash against the high value of my grandfather's house. But even that massive sum was not enough to cover the angry, powerful investors threatening to expose Greg's fraud. They needed more. They needed liquid, completely untraceable assets. They needed my grandfather's hidden floor safe, which contained hundreds of thousands of dollars in bearer bonds and rare gold coins. That is exactly why they had shipped my mother up from Florida. That is exactly why they had waited until they thought I was safely out of state at a conference in Chicago. They were going to completely hollow out my entire life, steal my property, take my inheritance, and use my safe assets to magically patch the massive hole in their criminal enterprise. And when I accidentally came home early and caught them in the act, they quickly, ruthlessly pivoted, weaponizing a fake psychiatric evaluation to brand me insane and throw me onto the street so they could finish the robbery in peace. I sat in the dim light of Sarah's kitchen, shaking with a cold, terrifying clarity. My husband was a massive fraud. My mother was his desperate, incredibly greedy accomplice. I now had every single piece of digital evidence I needed to put them both in federal prison for a very, very long time. I could call the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. I could hand them this laptop walkaway and happily watch Greg and Beverly get dragged out of their comfortable stolen lives in handcuffs. The urge to pick up Sarah's landline phone and dial the federal authorities was so overwhelming it physically ached in my bones. But my professional forensic training threw up a massive glaring red flag. I stopped staring hard at the glowing screen. If I called the FBI today, federal agents would immediately raid Greg's corporate offices. They would seize all of his servers, freeze every single bank account tied to his name, and place his entire firm into a massive federal receivership. It would be a spectacular, highly public downfall, but there was a catastrophic life-ruining catch for me. Because Greg had already fraudulently secured the $600,000 home equity loan against my house, and because he had already commingled those stolen funds into his fraudulent corporate accounts, the federal government would legally see my grandfather's house as an asset directly tied to the Ponzi scheme. The federal authorities do not care about tragic family drama. They care about securing immediate restitution for wealthy defrauded victims. If the FBI moved in right now, they would automatically seize my house. They would liquidate the property I bought with my grandfather's trust to pay back the investors Greg had swindled. I would eventually be cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, but the legal process would take years. I would be left completely homeless, financially ruined, and permanently stripped of the only legacy my grandfather had left me. I could not let that happen. I absolutely refused to become innocent collateral damage in their massive federal indictment. I had to separate my personal assets from his deeply toxic crimes before I dropped the final hammer. I needed to legally, quietly, and completely untangle my house from his fraudulent web. And I needed to do it while they still firmly believed I was a broken, helpless, crazy woman wandering the rainy streets with absolutely no resources. I closed the hidden server directories and carefully erased my digital footprints from Greg's system, ensuring my late-night intrusion remained completely undetected. I shut the laptop, the screen going dark, and sat in the quiet silence of the tiny kitchen. The intense fear that had paralyzed me on my front porch yesterday was completely gone. The deep sorrow over losing my mother and my husband had entirely evaporated. They had thought I was weak. They had assumed I would simply roll over, accept my terrible fate, and disappear into a psychiatric ward while they happily spent my money. They had heavily relied on my lifelong habit of sacrificing my own needs for the sake of the family. But they had awakened something else entirely. I was no longer the compliant wife or the dutiful, constantly overlooked daughter. I was a highly trained financial investigator with the exact digital blueprints to their entire criminal destruction. I knew their deepest secrets. I knew their incredibly desperate timeline. And I knew exactly how to build a trap they would willingly, arrogantly walk right into. Tomorrow morning, I would not go to the police. I would go find the one man in Seattle powerful enough to help me execute a flawless legal ambush. The war had just begun, and I was holding all the winning cards. I woke up on the lumpy fabric sofa in Sarah the maid's tiny apartment, just as the grey Seattle dawn began to bleed through the thin curtains. My entire body ached from sleeping in damp clothes, and the sheer emotional exhaustion of the previous day weighed heavily on my chest. But despite the physical discomfort, my mind was firing on all cylinders. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, mentally organizing the explosive digital evidence I had managed to extract from my husband's secure company servers the night before. I had the encrypted ledgers proving Greg was running a massive Ponzi scheme. I had the specific transaction logs detailing the $50,000 bribe paid to his corrupt business partner to forge the home equity documents. I had absolute proof that my mother Beverly had knowingly participated in the financial ambush to cover her own devastating investment losses. I had all the ammunition required to destroy them. But having digital proof and executing actual justice are two entirely different things. I was a highly skilled forensic accountant, not a seasoned litigator. To take down a multi-million-dollar fraud ring and protect my grandfather's house from being completely absorbed by a federal asset seizure, I needed a lawyer. And I did not just need any local attorney. I needed a shark. I needed the kind of high-level corporate litigator who billed $1,000 an hour and annihilated arrogant white-collar criminals before breakfast. There was just one massive glaring problem standing in my way. I had exactly $20 to my name. Greg had flawlessly drained my personal checking accounts, emptied our joint life savings, and completely frozen my credit lines. I could not even afford to pay for a standard legal consultation fee, let alone afford a massive retainer for a top-tier law firm. I sat at the small kitchen table, sipping the instant coffee Sarah had kindly left for me before she went to work tracing the rim of the ceramic mug with my thumb. I felt a cold wave of anxiety wash over me. Who would possibly take a highly complex federal fraud case for a penniless woman who currently looked like a raving lunatic on paper, all thanks to Greg's completely forged psychiatric evaluation? Then a sudden memory flashed through my mind. I remembered a distinguished face from my grandfather's funeral 2 years ago, Judge William Harrison. He was a fiercely loyal retired federal judge who had served on the bench in the Pacific Northwest for 40 years. More importantly, he was my grandfather's absolute oldest and closest friend. They had grown up together, built their lives and careers in Seattle together, and shared a bond that was significantly thicker than blood. My grandfather had trusted William implicitly with his deepest secrets, including his severe concerns about my mother's boundless financial greed. If there was a single person in this entire city who possessed the power to help me, and who would believe my story over my mother's meticulously crafted lies, it was him. I borrowed a clean, oversized woolen sweater from Sarah, washed my face with cold water in her tiny bathroom, and took a long, quiet bus ride across the city to Mercer Island. The bus dropped me off just a few miles away from the home Greg and my mother had stolen from me. Judge Harrison lived in a modest, beautifully kept mid-century home overlooking the dark waters of Lake Washington. When I walked up the driveway and rang the heavy brass doorbell, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. It had been 2 full years since I last saw him. I was terrified that he might have already spoken to Greg. I was terrified he might look at me and see the unstable, dangerous woman my husband had described to the local police and the bank manager. The heavy wooden door slowly opened. William stood there, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp, incredibly intelligent eyes scanning me from head to toe. He did not ask why I was wearing ill-fitting clothes or why I had arrived unannounced on foot in the morning cold. He took one look at the exhaustion and desperation etched deeply into my face, opened the door wider, and silently ushered me into his warm book-lined study. I sat down in a worn leather armchair across from his desk and told him absolutely everything. I spoke for nearly an hour. I told him about coming home early from my business trip to Chicago. I told him about the sledgehammers, the destroyed oak floorboards, and the exposed metal safe. I told him about the forged home equity loan, the completely fake psychiatric evaluation, and the massive bribe paid to the corrupt state notary. Finally, I told him the most devastating, twisted truth of all, that my mother had secretly lost her entire retirement fund to Greg's Ponzi scheme, and she was actively helping him steal my grandfather's inheritance to aggressively cover their criminal tracks. William did not interrupt me a single time. He sat perfectly still behind his desk, his hands steepled thoughtfully under his chin, his expression darkening with a profound, terrifying anger with every word I spoke. When I finally finished my story, the silence in the quiet study was incredibly heavy. "Beverly always was a deeply selfish, wretched woman," William said finally, his voice rumbling with a quiet, absolute fury. "Your grandfather knew she would eventually try to drain you dry. That is exactly why he left that hidden safe exclusively to you. To think she would resort to forging federal medical records and actively destroying his home just to cover for a common thief. It is utterly despicable." He leaned forward, picking up the heavy receiver of his desk phone. "You need a litigator, Clara. Someone who deeply understands the brutal mechanics of complex financial crimes and does not ever play nice. You need someone who will tear them to absolute shreds in front of the authorities." "I have absolutely no money, William." I admitted the shame burning hot and uncomfortable in my cheeks. Greg took every last cent I owned. I cannot afford to pay for an attorney. William waved his hand with total dismissal, his eyes completely hard and resolute. "You let me worry about the financial retainer. Your grandfather saved my life in Vietnam 50 years ago. I will be damned if I let his daughter's greedy husband steal the roof over your head while I'm still drawing breath." He dialed a number and spoke in hushed, incredibly urgent tones. Less than 2 hours later, I was sitting in a sleek glass-enclosed conference room downtown directly across from Jonathan Davis. Jonathan was a high-profile corporate litigator who practically radiated a ruthless predatory competence. He wore a crisp, flawlessly tailored suit and possessed the cold, highly calculating eyes of an apex predator perfectly adapted to the urban financial jungle. He absolutely despised white-collar criminals. He had spent his early career working as a prosecutor, watching arrogant, wealthy con artists destroy the lives of innocent working-class families, and he pursued corporate fraud cases with a terrifying personal vengeance. I laid out the forged home equity loan documents I had secured from the bank manager, placing them carefully alongside the printed digital ledgers I had hacked from Greg's servers the night before. Jonathan reviewed the paperwork with terrifying speed, his eyes darting analytically across the complex columns of numbers and pausing heavily on the bright red notary stamp. "You have a very solid, undeniable case for severe financial fraud, Clara," Jonathan said, his voice clipped deep and highly professional. "The digital trail confirming the $50,000 wire transfer to the notary is the absolute smoking gun. We can easily prove the forgery, but we have a massive, extremely volatile problem regarding your grandfather's house." He tapped his expensive silver pen against the polished mahogany conference table, leaning forward to ensure I understood the gravity of the situation. "If we simply file a standard civil lawsuit against your husband and your mother right now, the court system will easily drag this out for 3 to 5 agonizing years. Civil litigation moves at an incredibly glacial pace. Greg's high-priced defense attorneys will bury us in endless procedural motions and massive discovery requests. Meanwhile, the bank will absolutely foreclose on your house because the monthly mortgage payments on that fraudulent $600,000 loan will go unpaid. You will completely lose your grandfather's property long before we ever see the inside of a courtroom. My stomach dropped into my shoes. So what do? I asked, feeling the familiar, suffocating grip of panic trying to claw its way back up my throat. I cannot lose that house. It is the only thing I have left of my grandfather. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, a sharp, incredibly dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. We do not use the civil courts, he said softly, his voice laced with cold authority. We use the heavy artillery of the federal government, but we cannot just call the Federal Bureau of Investigation today and hand them this file. He paused, letting the silence emphasize his next point. If the FBI raids Greg's firm right now based on an anonymous tip, the Securities and Exchange Commission will immediately place all of his corporate and personal assets into a massive federal receivership. Because your house is currently tied up in that fraudulent home equity loan, and because you are legally married to him, the federal government will automatically seize your property. They will liquidate your grandfather's house to pay back the furious investors Greg swindled. You will be completely cleared of criminal charges eventually, but your house will be gone forever, sold at a government auction to compensate his victims. I stared at him, absorbing the brutal, unyielding reality of the federal legal system. The law did not care about my tragic family drama or my mother's betrayal. The federal authorities only cared about securing immediate financial restitution for defrauded victims. I need to completely separate my personal assets from his toxic crimes, I said, my forensic accountant, instincts aligning perfectly with his ruthless legal strategy. Exactly, Jonathan replied, pointing a finger directly at me. We need to completely untangle your life from his sinking ship before we let it utterly capsize. And to do that safely, we cannot just accuse them of a crime. We need them to willingly, arrogantly confess to their crimes on the permanent record right in front of federal authorities before the authorities actually freeze the assets. We spent the next 4 hours locked in that conference room, meticulously building a flawless, incredibly complex legal trap. Jonathan explained that the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission have incredibly strict compliance laws regarding the voluntary transfer of massive assets during corporate fraud. If an individual willingly signs over a high-value property during an active ongoing scheme, and they do so with the explicit documented intent to hide assets from federal regulators, it triggers an immediate catastrophic felony charge for everyone involved in the transaction. We needed Greg and Beverly to completely incriminate themselves. We needed them to proudly admit in front of highly credible witnesses that they were illegally forcing me to sign away my property to cover their fraudulent tracks. If we could capture that exact moment of supreme arrogance, the federal authorities would instantly classify my house as stolen property, extracted under extreme duress, entirely exempting it from the federal receivership liquidation process. My grandfather's legacy would be completely protected by the very laws Greg was actively trying to break. But how do we get them to voluntarily confess to a federal crime? I asked, pacing the length of the rich mahogany office, my mind racing through the logistics. Greg is a malicious liar, but he's not stupid. He knows exactly how to play the corporate game. He will never admit to running a Ponzi scheme on the official record. Jonathan closed his leather-bound legal pad with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed loudly in the quiet room. You are going to use their greatest psychological weakness against them, Clara. You're going to use their absolute unshakable certainty that you are weak, compliant, and deeply desperate for their family approval. The plan we devised that afternoon was incredibly risky, emotionally brutal, and required me to play the most difficult role of my entire life. I had to walk right back into the lion's den. I had to successfully convince the husband who stole my life savings and the mother who threw me into the freezing rain that they had completely won the war. I had to make them truly believe that their cruel psychological manipulation had worked flawlessly, that the fake psychiatric evaluation had entirely broken my spirit, and that I was fully ready to surrender everything I owned just to make the emotional pain stop. You have to play the broken victim one last time. Clara Jonathan warned me, his expression entirely serious and unyielding. You have to swallow your pride entirely and let them think They are the smartest people in the room. They will be so utterly blinded by their own greed and their desperate need to secure the cash to save the failing firm that they will happily dig their own graves. I will handle the federal authorities. I will make sure the undercover agents are in place and the legal paperwork is completely ready to strike. Your only job is to set the perfect bait. I looked out at the massive glass window of Jonathan's office, watching the dark, heavy cloud rolling ominously over the Seattle skyline. I thought about the sheer paralyzing terror I had felt standing outside my bedroom door, listening to the violent destruction of my sanctuary. I thought about the complete, utter abandonment I felt when my own sister mocked my desperation on the diner telephone. They had treated me like disposable financial collateral for a decade. They had assumed I would simply roll over and disappear into the background just like I always did. I turned back to face Jonathan. My posture was perfectly straight, and my voice was completely stripped of any remaining sorrow or fear. "Draw up the necessary legal documents," Jonathan Russer said smoothly, a cold resolve settling permanently into my chest. I know exactly how to give my husband and my mother the performance of a lifetime. The morning light filtering through the small window of Sarah the housekeeper's apartment felt harsh and unforgiving. I sat alone at the edge of the worn fabric sofa, staring down at the cheap prepaid cellular phone resting on the scarred coffee table. Jonathan, the ruthless corporate litigator, who was now steering my legal counteroffensive, had provided me with the untraceable phone the previous afternoon. He had given me a singular, terrifyingly difficult task. I had to completely swallow my pride. I had to utterly extinguish the hardened, vindictive forensic accountant I had become over the last 48 hours. I needed to reach deep inside myself and resurrect the terrified, compliant, broken woman my family desperately wanted me to be. The entire federal trap depended entirely on my ability to act. If my husband Greg suspected for even a single fraction of a second that I was consulting with a high-powered attorney, he would instantly execute the final stages of his massive Ponzi scheme. He would vanish, the federal authorities would freeze the estate, and my grandfather's house on Mercer Island would be seized and liquidated to pay off Greg's furious investors. To protect my legacy and secure my absolute revenge, I had to willingly step right back into the psychological slaughterhouse my mother and my husband had built for me. I had to make them believe they had completely destroyed me. I picked up the small plastic phone. My hands were trembling, but this time the physical shaking was not born from fear. It was born from pure, concentrated adrenaline. I closed my eyes and practiced my breathing. I needed to sound exactly like a woman who had spent the entire night shivering on the wet concrete of the Seattle streets. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty on my mother's face when she snatched my purse. I thought about the condescending smirk Greg wore when he locked the deadbolt and left me in the freezing rain. I let the raw, suffocating helplessness of that terrible night wash completely over my body until my chest tightened and my throat constricted with genuine emotion. I opened my eyes, pressed the call button, and held the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before Greg answered. His voice came through the small speaker, sharp, cautious, and intensely irritated. "Hello, who is this?" "Greg," I whispered. I forced my voice to crack perfectly on the second syllable of his name. I let out a jagged, desperate breath, allowing a pathetic, trembling sob to bleed directly into the receiver. "Please, Greg, please do not hang up on me." Hang. There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, ambient background noise of his corporate office. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was leaning back in his expensive leather executive chair, a smug, deeply satisfied smile spreading across his handsome face. He was drinking in the glorious sound of my absolute defeat. "Clara," he finally replied. His tone was dripping with that familiar, sickeningly smooth condescension. He spoke to me as if he were addressing a highly unstable, dangerous patient. "Where are you? Your mother and I have been worried sick. We were just about to call the local hospitals to see if you had been admitted for another severe manic episode." I squeezed my eyes tightly shut physically, fighting the intense urge to scream at him. I had to stay entirely in character. "I am at a coffee shop." I sobbed, forcing my voice to tremble with exhausted desperation. "I slept on a bus bench last night, Greg. It was freezing. I have absolutely no money. You completely drained our accounts. My credit cards are declining everywhere. I have nothing to eat. I have nowhere to go. Please, I am begging you. I cannot do this anymore." He let out a heavy theatrical sigh, playing the role of the burdened, long-suffering husband to absolute perfection. "Clara, you brought this entirely upon yourself. We tried to do things the easy way. We tried to get you the psychological help you so clearly need, but you became violent. You attacked your own mother in your delusional state. We had to protect ourselves and the family assets." "You won!" I cried out, letting my voice rise in a pitch of flawless manufactured panic. "I concede, Greg. You and my mother completely won. I cannot fight you anymore. I do not have the strength. I do not have the resources. I just want the overwhelming pain to stop. I want to leave Seattle forever." The line went completely quiet again. I had cast the lure perfectly into the water, and now I just had to wait for his massive, fragile ego to take the bait. I knew Greg's psychological profile better than he knew himself. He craved ultimate submission. He needed to feel like a financial god, a man who could easily crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. Hearing me verbally surrender was a powerful, intoxicating drug to him. "What exactly are you proposing, Clara?" he asked, slowly, his voice dropping into a cold, calculating register. "I will give you the house," I said, pushing the words through a series of broken, hiccuping sobs. "I will sign the total property transfer paperwork over to your holding company. I will legally validate the home equity line of credit you took out. I will not contest a single thing. You can have my grandfather's property. You can have the money. You can have absolutely everything. Just give me $50,000 in cash so I can disappear and start over in a completely different state." I chose the sum of $50,000 with extreme precision. If I had asked for $500,000, Greg would have instantly rejected the demand and suspected a trap. If I had asked for nothing, his deep paranoia would have been triggered. But $50,000 was the exact perfect amount. To a desperate white-collar criminal drowning in millions of dollars of fraudulent debt, $50,000 was an incredibly cheap, highly attractive bribe to permanently silence the only person who could expose his crimes. It was a bargain he could not possibly refuse. $50,000, Greg repeated softly, testing the weight of the number in his mouth. Yes, I wept into the receiver. That is all I want. Just enough to buy a cheap used car, rent a quiet apartment somewhere far away, and never see you or my mother ever again. I will sign whatever legal documents you put in front of me. I will swear I am completely sound of mind. Just please, give me the cash and let me go. "I will have to think about this, Clara," Greg replied smoothly, his arrogance fully restored. "I need to consult with my legal team to ensure your mental instability will not compromise the permanent property transfer. I will call you back on this number by this evening. Do not go anywhere." He disconnected the call without waiting for my response. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the blank digital screen. I stopped crying instantly. My breathing returned to a slow, steady, clinical rhythm. The first phase of Jonathan's trap had been successfully deployed. Greg was deeply hooked. Now I just had to wait for him to reel me in. 10 minutes later, the small plastic phone vibrated violently against the wooden coffee table. It was not a phone call. It was a text message. I opened the screen and saw a message from an unrecognized number, but the venomous tone of the words was entirely unmistakable. It was my mother. Beverly could not resist the overwhelming malicious urge to kick me while she firmly believed I was bleeding out on the ground. The text message read perfectly clear on the small screen. "Greg told me you finally surrendered. You should have known your place years ago, Clara. You were always so incredibly arrogant, always thinking you were smarter than everyone else, just because you went to some fancy college. This is exactly what happens when you refuse to be a supportive daughter and a loyal wife. Take the $50,000 and disappear. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family." I sat in the quiet apartment reading those vicious sentences over and over again. A decade ago, those words would have completely shattered my soul. I would have spent days agonizing over what I had done wrong, internalizing her cruel rejection and trying desperately to find a way to earn her maternal love back. But sitting there now, armed with the terrifying knowledge of her massive complicity in a federal Ponzi scheme, her words did not hurt me at all. They only fueled the cold, burning furnace of my determination. My mother needed to feel utterly superior. She needed to believe she had totally conquered the ungrateful daughter who dared to protect her own grandfather's inheritance. So I gave her exactly what she wanted. I typed a brief, pathetic response and hit send. "I am sorry, Mom. You were right. I am completely broken. I will take the money and leave. I set the phone down and waited. I did not have to wait long. 2 hours later, the phone rang again. It was Greg. His voice was completely different now. The cautious hesitation from our earlier conversation was entirely gone. He sounded buoyant, energized, and deeply dangerously victorious. Clara, he said briskly, bypassing any form of greeting, I have spoken with our legal counsel, and I have discussed the situation extensively with your mother. We have generously decided to accept your completely voluntary offer. We will provide you with a cashier's check for $50,000, and in exchange, you will legally sign over the complete and total deed to the Mercer Island property, effectively validating all prior home equity transactions. Thank you, I whispered into the phone, injecting my voice with a profound trembling sense of relief. Thank you, Greg. I can come to the office this afternoon to sign the paperwork. No, Greg interrupted sharply, a cruel, incredibly calculating edge entering his tone. You are not coming to the office. We are going to do this my way. My stomach tightened slightly. What do you mean, I asked, allowing genuine confusion to seep into my voice. This Saturday night is the massive 5th anniversary gala for my wealth management firm. Greg explained, his voice swelling with deep narcissistic pride. We have rented out the grand ballroom at the downtown hotel. Every single major investor, every prominent board member, and every wealthy client will be in attendance. It is going to be the most important public relations event of my entire career. I squeezed the phone tightly, my mind racing. I knew about the gala. I had spent the last 3 months organizing the catering, managing the guest list, and balancing the budget for the lavish event before I went to Chicago. But I did not understand why he was bringing it up now. You are going to attend the gala. Greg continued outlining his deeply twisted, manipulative plan. You are going to wear a beautiful gown. You are going to put on a radiant, loving smile. You are going to stand right by my side on that grand stage in front of 300 of my most elite investors. And when I give my keynote address about the incredible financial stability and the beautiful family values of this firm, you're going to publicly sign the property transfer documents right there on the podium. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his demand actually left me speechless for a moment. I realized exactly what he was doing. Greg's Ponzi scheme was aggressively collapsing. His investors were getting restless, demanding to see tangible proof of the firm's liquidity and asset security. What better way to pacify a room full of panicked, wealthy clients than a grand, highly public theatrical display? He wanted to parade me in front of them as the deeply devoted, highly supportive wife who believed in his firm so completely that she was willingly surrendering a massive prime piece of real estate into the company's holding portfolio. He wanted to use my public humiliation to save his criminal empire. Greg? No. I pleaded, shifting seamlessly back into the role of the terrified, broken victim. Please do not make me do that. I cannot stand on a stage in front of all those people. I look terrible. I am so exhausted. Please just let me sign the papers privately in an office. I do not want to be a public spectacle. My desperate resistance only made him significantly bolder. His voice grew incredibly hard and uncompromising. You do not dictate the terms anymore, Clara. This is a non-negotiable condition of our deal. You will stand on that stage, you will smile for the cameras, and you will legally sign your grandfather's house over to me while my investors watch. If you refuse, or if you try to cause a scene, I will personally guarantee that you leave that ballroom in a police cruiser and you will rot in a psychiatric ward for the rest of your life. Do we have an absolute understanding? I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, masking the profound, deeply satisfying thrill that was currently racing through my entire body. Greg had just given me the absolute greatest gift a forensic accountant and a corporate litigator could possibly ask for. He had personally invited me into a closed room filled entirely with his defrauded victims, and he was publicly demanding that I sign fraudulent federal documents under extreme documented duress. It was the exact perfect scenario Jonathan had described in the conference room. It was the ultimate, inescapable legal death trap, and Greg was building the entire thing himself. Yes, Greg, I whispered, letting out a soft, defeated sob. I understand. I will be at the gala. I will smile for your investors. I will sign the papers. Just please have the $50,000 check ready for me. The check will be waiting for you the second the ink dries on that property deed, Greg replied smugly. Go buy yourself a decent dress, Clara. You represent my firm on Saturday night. I expect you to look flawless." He hung up the phone. The mechanical dial tone buzzed loudly in the quiet kitchen. I pulled the device away from my ear, placed it gently on the wooden table, and slowly stood up. There were no more tears. There was no more shaking. I walked over to the small window and looked out at the busy Seattle street below. My husband thought he was a brilliant, untouchable mastermind. My mother thought she had successfully manipulated her way into a luxurious retirement. They truly believed they had completely shattered my spirit and forced me into absolute submission. They had absolutely no idea that when they demanded I stand on that stage and sign away my life, they had just handed me the match I was going to use to burn their entire fraudulent world straight to the ground. Saturday night arrived with a chilling absolute clarity that settled deep into my bones. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my temporary hotel room, staring intently at the woman looking back at me. For 10 long years, I had deliberately made myself invisible. I had worn muted colors, sensible shoes, and quiet, accommodating expressions, all to ensure I never outshone my husband or threatened my mother's incredibly fragile ego. I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to be the perfect, reliable background character in their grandiose, deeply selfish play. That version of me, the eager-to-please daughter and the compliant wife, died shivering on a rainy concrete porch. Tonight, I was attending Greg's massive 5-year anniversary gala, and I was absolutely not going to hide in the shadows anymore. I had gone out and purchased a sleek, incredibly powerful black dress. It was structured, unapologetic, and tailored with lethal precision. I paired it with high, sharp heels that clicked with authority and a slash of deep, striking red lipstick. I did not look like a broken, defeated wife crawling back for a measly $50,000 handout. I looked like a highly trained forensic accountant who was about to execute a flawless financial demolition. I grabbed my purse, which contained the fake transfer documents Greg demanded I sign, and walked out the door. The taxi ride downtown was a blur of neon lights and dark, rain-slicked streets. I sat in the back seat, focusing my mind entirely on the mission ahead. I stepped out of my cab in front of the most exclusive, opulent downtown hotel in Seattle. A small army of valets was rushing frantically to park a steady stream of luxury vehicles. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women dripping in diamonds were making their way up the sweeping marble steps. This was Greg's ultimate fantasy, brought completely to life. He had rented out the entire grand ballroom to celebrate the monumental success of a wealth management firm that produced absolutely nothing but lies. Every massive floral arrangement, every crystal chandelier, and every single glass of imported champagne was paid for by the stolen retirement funds of the innocent people walking through those heavy doors. I walked up the marble steps, my sharp heels clicking rhythmically against the cold stone. The crisp sound anchored me. I was not afraid. The suffocating anxiety that used to choke me whenever I faced my toxic family was completely gone. I stepped through the heavy revolving doors and into the sprawling gilded lobby. Massive expensive banners bearing Greg's corporate logo hung dominantly from the high ceiling. A private string quartet played softly in the corner, adding a layer of artificial elegance to the crime scene. And standing directly in front of the golden registration table, blocking the entrance to the main ballroom, like a heavily armed sentry, was my younger sister, Jessica. Jessica was wearing a breathtaking floor-length emerald green designer gown. It was spun from pure silk and clung to her perfectly in all the right places, catching the warm lobby light with every movement. I recognized the dress instantly. It was a signature piece from a highly exclusive boutique in downtown Portland, the exact kind of place where a single garment costs more than most hard-working people make in an entire month. When Jessica spotted me approaching the registration table, her eyes immediately narrowed into cruel slits of pure, unfiltered malice. She marched forward, intentionally putting herself directly in my path to stop me from joining the crowd. She looked me up and down, her expression twisting into a familiar sneer of deep, unearned condescension. "Clara," she said, her voice dripping with venomous, entirely fake pity, "I honestly did not think you would actually have the nerve to show your face here tonight. Mom told me you were coming to beg Greg for the buyout money so you could run away. I cannot believe you are dragging your messy drama into Greg's big professional night. You look ridiculous trying to fit in here. You need to sign the papers quickly and leave through the back door before you embarrass the family any further." I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze, and I absolutely did not apologize. I stepped directly into her personal space, forcing her to look me dead in the eye. I noticed a small group of wealthy investors standing just a few feet away, sipping their drinks and turning their heads to watch our interaction. "That is an absolutely stunning dress, Jessica," I said, my voice carrying clearly and confidently across the quiet lobby, ensuring the bystanders could hear every single word. "Emerald green really brings out the color of your eyes. It is an absolute shame you had to commit felony wire fraud to buy it." Jessica's smug, arrogant smile froze instantly. The color began to drain rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. "What are you talking about?" she hissed, glancing nervously at the wealthy guests standing nearby. "Keep your voice down, Clara. You're acting crazy again." I did not lower my voice. In fact, I projected it with the precise, ringing clarity of a seasoned courtroom expert presenting damning evidence. "I am talking about the $3,250 transaction you made at the designer boutique in Portland exactly 4 days ago," I said smoothly. "You used a Visa Platinum card ending in 4829. The expiration date is 0827. The security code on the back is 314. I know this because that credit card is registered exclusively in my name, connected directly to the primary checking account that our mother and my husband illegally drained while I was flying home from Chicago." Jessica literally took a step backwards, stumbling slightly in her expensive stolen heels. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The nearby guests had completely stopped talking. They were openly staring at us now, their crystal champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. "You deliberately stole my credit card information, Jessica." I continued, my tone entirely clinical and completely devoid of any sisterly affection. "You used stolen funds to buy a dress you could never possibly afford on your own, just so you could stand in this lavish lobby and pretend to be part of the wealthy elite. Did you really think a certified forensic accountant would not notice a $3,000 fraudulent charge perfectly documented on an electronic bank statement? Did you honestly believe I would not immediately pull the timestamp security footage from the boutique to verify exactly who signed the electronic receipt?" "I do not know what you are talking about," Jessica stammered blindly. Her voice was trembling so badly it sounded like it belonged to a frightened child caught stealing candy. "I did not steal anything. Mom gave me that card. She told me you wanted me to have a nice dress for the gala. She told me you explicitly offered to pay for it as an apology for how terribly you behaved at the house." I let out a sharp, deeply humorless laugh that cut through the lobby tension. "Mom gave you a stolen card to buy an apology dress for a gala you thought I was too mentally unstable to attend. That is a fascinating legal defense, Jessica. You should absolutely try using it when the federal authorities ask you to explain your active participation in an organized financial conspiracy. I highly suggest you retain a very good criminal defense attorney by Monday morning, though I suppose you will have a hard time paying a massive legal retainer now that my credit lines are permanently locked." Jessica was physically shaking now. The unearned arrogance she had proudly worn like a shield for her entire life had completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated panic. The wealthy investors standing near us were whispering aggressively to one another, their eyes burning highly judgmental holes into Jessica's stolen green silk dress. She had wanted to publicly humiliate me at the door and force me into submission. Instead, she had just been spectacularly exposed as a common desperate thief in front of the exact high society crowd she so desperately wanted to impress. I leaned in, just a fraction of an inch closer, lowering my voice into a cold, lethal whisper that only she could fully hear. "You made a choice when you watched from your bedroom window as Mom left me sitting in the freezing rain on that porch 15 years ago, Jessica. You made another choice when you mocked my absolute desperation on the phone while I was homeless and destitute in Seattle. You chose to be a parasite, and parasites always die when the host finally cuts off the blood supply. Enjoy the dress. It is the very last luxury item you will ever wear as a free woman." I did not wait for her to formulate a pathetic response. I simply turned my back on her and walked confidently toward the heavy double doors of the grand ballroom. I left her standing entirely alone in the lobby, hyperventilating and completely surrounded by the harsh, judging whispers of the Seattle elite. Two sharply dressed event staff members respectfully pulled the massive doors open for me. I stepped over the threshold and finally walked into the lion's den. The sheer scale of the extravagance inside the ballroom was absolutely nauseating. Massive, meticulously carved ice sculptures of Greg's corporate logo melted slowly under warm theatrical spotlights. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated smoothly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and top-shelf liquor. A magnificent live band played smooth jazz from a raised platform draped in expensive crushed velvet. Hundreds of people in stunning evening wear laughed securely and clinked their crystal glasses, entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that their hard-earned wealth was currently funding this massive fraudulent illusion. My eyes scanned the vast sea of faces, cutting straight through the noise and the bright lights with absolute precision. I was looking for the specific structural elements of the trap Jonathan and I had so carefully designed over the last few days. I spotted my mother, Beverly, first. She was standing proudly near the front of the room, wearing a glittering gold gown, holding a glass of champagne, and laughing loudly with a group of older, very wealthy-looking women. She was entirely in her element, feeding hungrily off the attention, thoroughly enjoying the stolen prestige of her son-in-law's criminal company. She had absolutely no idea that her secret $800,000 retirement fund was entirely vaporized. She had absolutely no idea that her entire secure future was about to be completely incinerated in front of her new high society friends. I looked past her systematically, scanning the perimeter of the sprawling crowded room. And then I saw him, Jonathan, my fierce, incredibly ruthless attorney. He was standing casually near the back bar, holding a tumbler of sparkling water, blending perfectly into the elite crowd in his immaculate charcoal suit. He did not wave to me. He did not acknowledge me in any obvious or disruptive way, but as my eyes met his across the crowded, noisy room, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The visual confirmation was exactly what I needed. It meant the massive legal trap was completely primed. It meant the carefully prepared forensic dossiers had been successfully distributed to the appropriate federal prosecutors. And most importantly, it meant our highly specialized, heavily armed special guests from the federal government were already secretly moving into position throughout the hotel. The exits were completely covered. The digital perimeters were entirely locked down. The net was fully cast, and there was absolutely no escape for anyone involved in Greg's massive Ponzi scheme. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cool, conditioned air of the ballroom fill my lungs. The terrifying anxiety that had plagued me for the last 4 days was completely eradicated. I was no longer playing the role of the broken, defeated victim. I was the absolute architect of their ultimate destruction. I walked slowly into the center of the crowd, my sleek black dress cutting a sharp, undeniable path through the sea of glittering attendees. I moved with the calm, lethal grace of a woman who knows exactly how the story ends. The countdown had officially begun. Every second that ticked by brought my husband and my mother one step closer to absolute irreversible ruin. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and turned my full attention to the massive, brightly lit stage at the front of the room. I was ready to sign away my grandfather's house. I was perfectly ready to give Greg the public surrender he so desperately craved. And I was absolutely ready to watch his entire world burn to ashes. The grand ballroom of the hotel was a masterpiece of illusion. I stood near the back of the massive space, my black dress blending into the shadows, and watched my husband command the room. Greg was standing at a clear acrylic podium in the absolute center of the brightly lit stage. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed his wealth management firm's logo in crisp, glowing silver letters. He was in his element. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than some people made in a year, paid for entirely by the stolen money of the 300 people sitting in the audience. I watched the crowd. These were Seattle's elite. There were tech executives, retired surgeons, local politicians, and seasoned real estate developers. They sat at round tables covered in heavy silk linens, eating imported caviar and drinking vintage champagne. They looked up at Greg with absolute adoration and complete trust. He was their golden boy. He was the financial genius who consistently promised them double-digit returns in a volatile market. I looked at their smiling faces and felt a deep twisting knot of pity in my stomach. As a forensic accountant, I did not just see people in expensive clothes. I saw walking balance sheets. I saw retirement funds that no longer existed. I saw college savings accounts that had been completely vaporized to fund the very champagne they were currently swallowing. Greg leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with manufactured sincerity. He spoke about the core values of his firm. He used words like trust family and secure investments. He talked about navigating difficult economic waters with a steady hand. He promised them that their futures were safe with him. Every single word out of his mouth was a meticulously crafted lie designed to pacify the growing unrest of his wealthiest clients. The Ponzi scheme was aggressively collapsing. His liquidity was completely dried up, and this entire gala was a desperate, highly orchestrated distraction. And then, right on cue, Greg shifted the focus of his keynote address. His voice softened, taking on an intimate, deeply emotional tone that made my skin crawl. He told the crowd that a strong financial firm requires an incredibly strong personal foundation. He spoke about sacrifice and partnership. He said that true wealth is not just about money, but about the unwavering support of the people you love. He gestured gracefully toward the audience and announced that tonight he wanted to share a profound symbol of that exact commitment. "My beautiful wife Clara is here tonight," Greg said, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "She has stood by my side since the very beginning. She believes in the vision and the robust financial health of this firm so deeply that tonight she has decided to voluntarily transfer a massive personal asset, a prime piece of Mercer Island real estate, directly into our corporate holding portfolio. This incredible gesture of faith will significantly expand our operational capital and guarantee our firm's growth for decades to come." The ballroom erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Hundreds of heads turned searching the room for the supportive, incredibly generous wife. Greg looked directly at me through the sea of tables. He smiled warmly for the crowd, but his eyes were completely dead. They held a cold, arrogant threat. He was silently daring me to disobey him. He was reminding me of the horrific psychiatric evaluation he held over my head. He fully expected me to walk up there, play the broken victim, and sign away my grandfather's legacy to save his criminal empire. I took a deep breath, smoothing my hands down the sides of my sleek black dress. The heavy dread that had weighed on me for days completely vanished. My heart was not racing. My hands were perfectly steady. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking down the center aisle toward the stage. As I walked past the tables, people clapped and smiled at me. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I saw my mother, Beverly, sitting at a prime VIP table right in the front row. She was wearing her glittering gold gown, absolutely beaming with narcissistic pride. She looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant smirk. She thought I had completely surrendered. She thought her secret retirement fund was about to be miraculously saved by my absolute financial ruin. I looked past her and caught a brief glimpse of Jonathan, my ruthless corporate attorney, standing quietly near the side exit. He gave me a single solid nod. The trap was ready. I climbed the short flight of stairs to the stage. The bright stage lights were blinding, but I did not blink. I walked directly over to Greg. He wrapped a heavy, possessive arm around my waist, squeezing me tightly against his side. The grip was supposed to look affectionate to the audience, but his fingers dug painfully into my ribs, a physical reminder of his control. He gestured to a small wooden table next to the podium. Sitting perfectly centered on the table was a thick stack of legal documents and an expensive fountain pen. It was the complete property transfer deed, pre-stamped by Todd Mitchell, his corrupt notary partner. All it needed was my signature to legally hand my grandfather's house over to a Ponzi scheme. Greg picked up the heavy fountain pen and held it out to me. "Show them how much you believe in us, Clara," he whispered softly, his voice meant only for my ears. "Sign the paper." I looked at the pen. I looked at the forged documents. I looked at the man who had drained my life savings and thrown me into the freezing rain. I did not take the pen. Instead, I smoothly slipped out of Greg's painful grip. I took one deliberate step forward, moving him slightly out of the way, and grasped the edges of the clear acrylic podium. I pulled the microphone exactly 1 inch closer to my mouth. Greg's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His hand still holding the pen dropped slightly to his side. "Clara," he muttered under his breath, a sharp edge of warning bleeding through his teeth. "What are you doing?" I ignored him completely. I looked out over the massive ballroom, meeting the eyes of the 300 elite guests. The polite applause had died down, replaced by a curious, expectant silence. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice rang out through the immense sound system. It was icy surgical and absolutely unwavering. I did not yell. I did not cry. I spoke with the precise, undeniable authority of a woman who knew exactly how the numbers worked. "My name is Clara Thomas." Greg introduced me as his supportive wife, but he conveniently forgot to mention my actual profession. "I am a certified forensic accountant. I specialize in tracking complex corporate fraud and uncovering hidden assets. And for the past 48 hours, I have been meticulously auditing the deeply encrypted internal ledgers of this wealth management firm." The silence in the room suddenly shifted. The curious energy instantly evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy wave of utter confusion. I heard a low murmur ripple through the front row. My mother's triumphant smile vanished completely, her face turning an ashen, sickly gray. Greg lunged forward, trying to casually grab my arm to pull me away from the podium. "Clara is currently suffering from a severe medical episode," he announced loudly to the crowd, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Please forgive her, she's incredibly confused." I sidestepped his grasp effortlessly, keeping my hands firmly planted on the podium. "I am not confused, Greg," I said directly into the microphone, "and I am absolutely not signing away my grandfather's home to patch a massive, gaping hole in a failing Ponzi scheme." The word Ponzi dropped into the ballroom like a physical explosive. A collective audible gasp echoed off the high ceiling. I turned my gaze back to the terrified audience. I began reading the real numbers from memory, ripping away Greg's carefully constructed illusion with every single sentence. "Greg just stood up here and told you that your investments are secure," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear over the rising murmurs. "He told you that the firm generated a $2 million profit in Q3. That is a complete and total fabrication. Q3 profits were not $2 million. They were negative $4 million. A man in the third row stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "What are you talking about?" he shouted, his face red with sudden panic. "I am talking about your money," I answered, locking eyes with him. "There are no commercial real estate acquisitions. There are no private corporate bonds. The official quarterly statements you receive in the mail are completely forged. When you deposit capital into this firm, your money is immediately routed through a complex web of dummy shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Your principal investments are being actively used to pay fake monthly dividends to older clients, creating the absolute illusion of profit." The murmurs escalated into loud, frantic shouts. Panic was spreading through the room like a highly contagious virus. People were standing up, grabbing their partners, their faces twisting in pure terror. "And the rest of your money," I continued, raising my voice just enough to cut through the mounting chaos. "The rest of your hard-earned retirement funds and college savings accounts are being aggressively liquidated to fund Greg's personal lifestyle. The custom tuxedo he's wearing right now was bought with your money. The massive ice sculptures melting in the lobby were bought with your money. The vintage champagne you are drinking tonight was purchased using your own drained retirement accounts." The ballroom absolutely exploded. 300 wealthy investors completely lost their minds simultaneously. Men were shouting furiously, pointing violently at the stage. Women were screaming in horror, dropping their crystal glasses onto the marble floor where they shattered into hundreds of pieces. The elegant, sophisticated gala had instantly dissolved into a terrifying riot of desperate, ruined people. In the front row, my mother Beverly leaped from her chair. Her face was contorted in absolute rage and sheer panic. "Security!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, waving her arms frantically at the hotel staff standing near the doors. "Get her off the stage! She is crazy! Drag her away right now!" But the hotel security guards did not move toward me. They were blocked by a sudden influx of men and women wearing dark windbreakers. Jonathan's special guests had arrived. The undercover federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were moving rapidly into the ballroom, securing the exits and pulling their badges out for the crowd to see. I turned my head and looked at Greg. The polished, arrogant wealth manager had completely ceased to exist. His custom tuxedo suddenly looked too big for him. His face was completely devoid of blood, his eyes wide and wild like a trapped animal. The realization that I had hacked his servers, found the hidden offshore routing numbers, and exposed his entire criminal enterprise to a room full of federal agents finally crashed down on him. He let out a guttural, terrifying roar of absolute fury. He dropped the expensive fountain pen and lunged violently across the stage, directly at me, his hands reaching desperately to rip the microphone from my hands and silence me by sheer force. The heavy brass doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not merely open. They were violently thrown apart with a deafening, thunderous crash that instantly silenced the chaotic screams of the panicked investors. Greg was suspended in midair, his hands reaching aggressively toward my throat, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. But the thunderous noise from the lobby shattered his momentum. He froze, stumbling awkwardly forward and catching himself heavily against the clear acrylic podium. The entire room turned as a massive, highly coordinated flood of men and women surged into the opulent space. This was not the standard hotel security team my mother had desperately called for. These men and women moved with absolute terrifying precision. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with bold yellow letters plastered across their backs. FBI, IRS, SEC, the three most terrifying acronyms any fraudulent wealth manager could ever possibly see in their entire lifetime. I stood perfectly still on the raised stage, smoothing the fabric of my sleek black dress completely untouched by the panic erupting around me. The fear that Greg had relied on for the past 10 years was entirely gone. Jonathan, my fierce and brilliant corporate litigator, had not just called the authorities on a random whim this evening. Exactly 72 hours prior, Jonathan had walked directly into the federal prosecutor's office downtown. He had hand-delivered the massive airtight forensic dossier I had meticulously compiled while sitting at a cramped kitchen table in my housekeeper's tiny apartment. That dossier contained every single encrypted ledger, every offshore routing number, and the exact time-stamped digital footprint of the $50,000 bribe Greg had used to secure the forged home equity loan. We had handed the federal government a fully wrapped, undeniable financial conviction on a silver platter. They had spent the last 3 days quietly locking down warrants, freezing the offshore accounts, and strategically positioning themselves around this very hotel, waiting for the perfect moment to execute a total operational takedown. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, completely uncompromising face, raised a heavy black megaphone to his mouth. His voice boomed across the vast ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and the melting ice sculptures. "Nobody move." The agent commanded the sheer authority in his tone, instantly freezing the 300 elite guests in their tracks. "This is a coordinated federal raid by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. This entire premises is now under federal lockdown. Place your hands where we can see them and step away from the exits immediately." The wealthy, panicked investors immediately complied. The men in expensive tuxedos and the women in designer gowns shrank back against the silk-covered tables, holding their hands in the air, staring in absolute horrified disbelief as the federal agents rapidly secured the perimeter of the room. But not everyone was willing to surrender quietly. Near the back of the ballroom, hovering desperately close to the kitchen service doors, was Todd Mitchell. Greg's sleazy, gambling-addicted business partner had seen the windbreakers and instantly recognized that his entire life was over. He tried to turn and sprint through the swinging wooden doors, hoping to vanish into the chaotic hotel kitchen. He did not even make it 3 steps. 2 massive FBI agents tackled him directly to the polished marble floor. The sickening thud of his body hitting the stone echoed loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. "Get off me!" Todd screamed hysterically, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror as the agents aggressively pinned his arms behind his back. "I did not do anything wrong. I am just a partner. Greg is the one running the firm." The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Todd's wrists echoed like a judge's final gavel. They hauled him to his feet. His expensive cologne could not hide the profound sour stench of his absolute panic. He was sweating profusely, his face pale and contorted with fear. He looked wildly around the room until his frantic eyes locked directly onto Greg, who was still standing paralyzed next to me on the stage. It was his idea. Todd screamed at the top of his lungs, desperately throwing his best friend and business partner directly under the bus to save his own skin. Greg set up the offshore shell companies. He begged me to notarize the forged house deed. He paid me $50,000 in cash to stamp that legal paperwork. I just stamped the paper. He is the mastermind. He stole all the money. Please, you have to believe me. I will testify to absolutely everything. Greg physically recoiled, as if he had been shot in the chest. His jaw dropped open, and the last remaining ounce of blood completely drained from his handsome face. The smooth, arrogant wealth manager, who had confidently commanded this massive room just 5 minutes ago, had entirely evaporated into thin air. In his place stood a broken, pathetic, terrified criminal who suddenly realized there was absolutely no escape from the federal prison system. His knees gave out. Greg collapsed heavily onto the wooden stage, his expensive midnight blue tuxedo pulling around him in a pathetic heap. He stared blankly at the floor, completely unresponsive, his mind utterly shattered by the speed and the totality of his absolute destruction. Down in the front row, the scene was equally catastrophic. My mother, Beverly, was suddenly surrounded by 3 federal agents. Her glittering gold gown, the one she had bought specifically to flaunt her stolen wealth in front of Seattle's elite society, suddenly looked incredibly cheap and utterly ridiculous. She clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate denial. "Excuse me," Beverly snapped, attempting to channel the deeply entitled, highly superior tone she had used to belittle me my entire life. "You have absolutely no right to speak to me. I am a victim here. I am a wealthy investor. I had absolutely no idea my son-in-law was running a fraudulent business. You need to let me leave this hotel right now before I call my personal attorneys." A female IRS agent stepped forward, her expression completely devoid of any sympathy. Sandra Beverly Thomas, the agent, said, her voice crisp and entirely professional. "You are being placed under arrest for active conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud, felony bank fraud, and the obstruction of a federal financial investigation." I watched my mother physically stumble backward, bumping hard into the silk-covered VIP table. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical, entirely unhinged pitch. "I did not commit any fraud. I am an innocent mother." "We have the fully encrypted digital ledgers, ma'am," the agent replied calmly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. "We have timestamp documentation proving you knowingly concealed an $800,000 retirement fund, willingly invested it into a verified Ponzi scheme, and actively participated in a coordinated plot to forge federal banking documents to cover your personal financial losses. We also have witness statements regarding your attempt to physically break into a secure floor safe on Mercer Island. Please place your hands behind your back." Beverly began to thrash wildly, fighting against the agents with a sudden desperate strength. She kicked her heels, screaming at the top of her lungs, completely humiliating herself in front of the exact high society crowd she had spent her entire life desperately trying to impress. "No," Beverly wailed, tears of pure selfish terror streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. "You cannot do this to me. I am a respectable woman. This is all Clara's fault. She set us up. She is crazy. You have to arrest my daughter." Nobody believed her. The wealthy investor standing nearby simply stared at her with deep, unvarnished disgust. They finally saw my mother for exactly what she was: a deeply greedy, completely toxic parasite who was perfectly willing to destroy her own flesh and blood to secure a comfortable retirement. The agents easily overpowered her, snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around her wrists. As they dragged her away toward the lobby, she continued to scream and thrash her glittering gold dress, dragging pathetically across the marble floor. I stood on the stage, watching the woman who gave birth to me being hauled away to face federal felony charges. A decade ago, seeing my mother in handcuffs would have completely shattered my heart. I would have felt an overwhelming, deeply misplaced sense of guilt. But standing there now, bathed in the bright theatrical lights of the grand ballroom, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, incredibly clean sense of peace. I had spent 28 years setting myself on fire just to keep her warm. I was completely done burning. 2 stern FBI agents climbed the short wooden stairs to the stage. They did not even look at me. They walked directly over to Greg, who was still kneeling on the floor in a state of absolute catatonic shock. They grabbed him roughly by the shoulders and hauled him to his feet. He was completely limp, offering absolutely zero resistance as they pulled his arms behind his back and secured the handcuffs. Before the agents could turn him around to lead him away, I took a slow, highly deliberate step forward. The ballroom was completely silent, save for the heavy breathing of the terrified investors. I reached over to the small acrylic table and picked up the thick stack of legal documents Greg had placed there just 10 minutes ago. It was the forged home equity line of credit and the absolute total property transfer deed. The paperwork he had demanded I sign to permanently hand over my grandfather's legacy to his criminal empire. I held the unsigned documents out in front of me. Greg slowly lifted his head. His eyes were completely hollow, devoid of the arrogant, vicious spark that had defined our entire marriage. He looked at the paperwork, and then he looked directly into my eyes. "You truly thought you were the smartest person in the room, Greg," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and carrying the absolute undeniable weight of total victory. "You thought you could completely isolate me, steal my entire past, and violently forge my future. You honestly believed that because I was quiet, I was weak. You forgot that I am the one who built the digital walls around your castle, and you forgot that I am the one who knows exactly how to tear them down." I let the thick stack of forged legal documents slip from my fingers. The heavy papers scattered completely across the wooden stage, falling gently over the tips of Greg's expensive leather shoes. "Enjoy federal prison, Greg," I said softly. "I hear they do not offer premium country club memberships in maximum security." Greg opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some pathetic, desperate apology, but no words came out. He was completely defeated. The federal agents roughly turned him around and marched him down the stairs, leading him away through the parted sea of utterly stunned, silent investors. I did not stay to watch him leave the ballroom. My work here was completely finished. My grandfather's house was entirely safe, protected by the exact federal compliance laws Greg had arrogantly tried to manipulate. My stolen personal funds would eventually be recovered through the massive federal restitution process. But more importantly, my absolute freedom had finally been secured. I turned my back on the empty acrylic podium and walked gracefully down the opposite side of the stage. The massive crowd of Seattle elites parted immediately for me, stepping aside with a profound, almost reverent respect. They no longer saw a broken, compliant wife. They saw the highly trained, incredibly dangerous forensic accountant who had single-handedly dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate in less than 48 hours. I kept my head held high, my sharp heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the polished marble floor. I walked directly through the heavy brass doors and back into the gilded hotel lobby. The scene unfolding in front of the registration table was a masterpiece of absolute beautiful chaos. Todd Mitchell was sitting handcuffed on a velvet bench, openly weeping and aggressively shouting out account routing numbers to a very busy federal agent. My mother, Beverly, was pinned against the registration desk by a female officer screaming hysterically about her ruined designer dress, and standing completely frozen in the center of the lobby was my sister, Jessica. Jessica was still wearing the stolen $3,000 emerald green silk gown. She had not managed to escape. Two severe-looking federal agents were currently interviewing her, holding up a digital printout of my stolen credit card statement. Jessica was sobbing violently, pointing frantic, trembling fingers at our mother. "She gave me the card," Jessica screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high lobby ceiling. "She told me to use it. I did not know it was stolen. She made me do it. You have to arrest her, not me." Beverly whipped her head around, her eyes bulging with absolute betrayal. "You ungrateful little parasite," Beverly shrieked back at her favorite daughter. "I gave you everything. I funded your entire pathetic life. I hope they lock you in a cell right next to me." I walked smoothly past them, completely, entirely, ignoring the toxic, chaotic screaming match erupting between the two women who had made my life a miserable, suffocating burden. They were exactly where they truly belonged. They were turning on each other like starved animals, desperately trying to save themselves, entirely consumed by the very greed that had completely destroyed them. I did not feel an ounce of pity. They had forged their own chains. Now they had to wear them. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool Seattle night. The rain had completely passed, leaving the city streets smelling incredibly clean and completely renewed. The flashing red and blue lights of the dozens of federal cruisers parked outside cast a beautiful, triumphant glow across the wet pavement. I took a deep, deeply satisfying breath of the fresh night air. I had absolutely no phone, and my bank accounts were still temporarily frozen by the federal authorities. But as I walked confidently down the street toward the waiting taxi Jonathan had arranged for me, I had never felt so incredibly wealthy in my entire life. The suffocating weight of my toxic family was permanently gone. The deceptive, crushing burden of my fraudulent marriage was entirely erased. I was finally completely free, and the rest of my beautiful, deeply peaceful life was entirely mine to build. If you are watching this and you have ever felt completely trapped by people who continuously demand you sacrifice your own happiness to feed their relentless, bottomless greed, I want you to remember something incredibly important. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You have the absolute right to set firm, uncompromising boundaries. You have the right to walk away. And you have the absolute right to fight back when they try to steal your peace. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below letting me know the exact city and time you are watching this video. Never stop protecting your own worth, and always remember that true justice is simply the beautiful consequence of the truth. 6 months have passed since the night my world was violently torn apart. I am standing in the center of my master bedroom, letting the warm afternoon sunlight wash over my face. I look down at my feet. The custom oak floors are completely and beautifully restored. There is absolutely no trace of the shattered wood, the thick drywall dust, or the violent physical wreckage my mother and my husband left behind when they aggressively tried to smash their way into my grandfather's hidden foundation safe. The new floorboards gleam with a fresh coat of polish reflecting the peaceful light coming through the large bay windows. The heavy metal safe is securely locked and buried safely beneath my feet, holding the exact financial legacy my grandfather intended for me to have. The house is completely quiet today, but it is a beautiful, deeply comforting kind of quiet. It is the sound of absolute safety and permanent ownership. I trace my hand along the smooth edge of my wooden dresser, remembering the sheer suffocating terror I felt standing in this exact spot, while armed police officers looked at me like I was a dangerous, unstable lunatic. That terrified, desperate woman feels like a completely different person now. She was a woman who routinely set herself on fire just to keep her deeply greedy family warm. I will never ever be that woman again. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying mechanical efficiency when you hand them an airtight, highly detailed forensic dossier. Greg is currently serving a 12-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The elite, arrogant wealth manager who proudly wore custom midnight blue tuxedos and drank expensive vintage champagne is now wearing a standard issue canvas uniform and eating whatever bland food they place on his metal tray. During his final sentencing hearing, he could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. The federal prosecutors completely and ruthlessly dismantled his entire arrogant facade in front of a packed courtroom. They systematically exposed his massive Ponzi scheme. They tracked every single stolen dollar across his international offshore accounts, and they seized every hidden asset he desperately tried to conceal. His wealthy country club friends abandoned him immediately the moment the scandal broke. His corrupt business partner, Todd, gladly testified against him to shave a few years off his own prison sentence, leaving Greg completely isolated and undefended. Greg honestly thought he could steal my past and forge my future with a completely fake psychiatric evaluation and a fraudulent home equity loan. Instead, he flawlessly forged his own permanent residency in a cold concrete cell. I watched him being led away in heavy steel handcuffs, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger and no lingering sorrow, just the cold, clean closure of a deeply necessary justice being served. The federal authorities were equally unforgiving when it came to dealing with my mother. Beverly truly thought her advanced age and her tragic manufactured tears would somehow miraculously save her from the severe consequences of her boundless financial greed. She was completely and utterly wrong, because she had actively participated in the extensive conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and had violently attempted to steal my grandfather's assets just to aggressively cover her own foolish investment losses. the federal government seized absolutely everything she owned. Her beautiful luxury condominium in sunny Florida was forcefully liquidated by the authorities to pay federal restitution to the innocent victims Greg had swindled. Her closet full of designer dresses, her expensive imported jewelry, and her carefully curated high society life evaporated into thin air overnight. Today, my mother lives alone in a dilapidated, drafty trailer park on the far outskirts of a bleak industrial town. She has absolutely no secret retirement fund left and no wealthy son-in-law to blindly fund her extravagant, expensive tastes. I heard from a very distant relative that she spends her days complaining bitterly to anyone in the trailer park who will listen, insisting endlessly that she is the true innocent victim of a massive legal misunderstanding. She absolutely refuses to accept the hard truth that she engineered her own miserable downfall by choosing a thief over her own daughter. And then there is my younger sister, Jessica, the deeply entitled woman who stood in a grand hotel lobby wearing a $3,000 emerald green designer gown and viciously mocked me for being homeless and destitute. The federal investigation easily and quickly uncovered her willing use of my stolen personal credit cards. While she somehow managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence by heavily cooperating with the federal authorities, she was hit with massive legal defense fees and crushing court-ordered financial restitution. Jessica is now working double shifts as a waitress at a greasy 24-hour diner just to keep the lights on in her tiny rented room. The absolute poetic irony of her current situation is not lost on me. She is now experiencing the exact same bone-deep physical exhaustion and terrifying financial desperation she so cruelly laughed at when I was standing in the pouring rain begging for my own stolen money. She actually called me once, crying hysterically and begging for a small cash loan to help pay her overdue utility bills. I listened to her sob into the receiver for exactly 1 minute before I quietly disconnected the call and permanently blocked her phone number. I had spent 10 long years blindly funding her reckless, entitled lifestyle. The Bank of Clara is officially and permanently closed. I hear a soft, polite knock on the bedroom doorframe. I turn around and see Sarah standing there holding a digital tablet and a neat stack of household vendor invoices. She is no longer wearing a faded housekeeper uniform or carrying cleaning supplies. Today, she is wearing a sharp professional blazer and a warm, genuine smile. I hired the wonderful woman who saved my life on the absolute worst night of my existence to be my personal estate manager. I doubled her previous salary, gave her full comprehensive medical benefits, and moved her out of that drafty, cramped apartment into a beautiful, secure home of her own. When my own flesh and blood locked me out in a freezing downpour and maliciously stole every single cent I owned, Sarah was the only person in the world who opened her door and offered me a warm blanket and a safe place to sleep. She looked at a penniless, shivering woman and saw a vulnerable human being who desperately needed help. My mother looked at her own daughter and saw absolutely nothing but a disposable financial asset to be drained and discarded. That is the hardest and most profoundly liberating psychological lesson I have learned through this entire horrific ordeal. Basic biology does not make a family. Sharing genetic DNA with someone does not automatically grant them the permanent right to disrespect you, exploit your kindness, or constantly destroy your peace of mind. True family are the people who fiercely and loyally protect you when you are at your absolute most vulnerable. They are the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them but your presence. Forgiveness is a beautiful, necessary thing for your own personal psychological healing, but forgiving toxic people absolutely does not mean you have to let them keep a designated seat at your dinner table. I finally forgave my family, so I could sleep peacefully at night without the heavy burden of resentment, but I also permanently changed the physical and emotional locks on my doors so they can never ever hurt me again. If you are watching this video and you have ever been the financial or emotional scapegoat for a deeply toxic family, I want you to know that you are absolutely not alone in your struggle. You do not have to accept abuse just because the people hurting you share your last name. You have the absolute unconditional right to walk away from people who only view you as an emotional punching bag or a convenient financial resource. Boundaries are not a form of cruel revenge. They are simply a necessary tool for your own survival and mental health. Please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if my personal story resonated with your own experiences today. Drop a comment below and let me know the exact city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Never stop fiercely protecting your own worth, and always remember that walking away from toxic people is the first beautiful step toward finally finding your own lasting peace. If you are watching this right now and you are shrinking yourself just to keep the peace with people who only use you for what you can provide, I want you to hear me clearly. Please stop. Stop setting yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. For years, I genuinely thought that if I just gave a little more, worked a little harder, and stayed quiet enough, I would finally earn the love and respect I so desperately craved from my own family. But you simply cannot buy genuine love with financial sacrifices. Love is absolutely not a transaction. Setting boundaries with the people you share your blood with is one of the hardest things you will ever do. Society constantly tells us that family is absolutely everything and that blood is thicker than water. But blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit your kindness, drain your resources, and leave you shivering in the cold. Setting boundaries is not cruel. It is pure survival. It is the profound realization that you have the fundamental right to protect your peace, your assets, and your future from anyone who threatens them, even if those threats come directly from your own parents or your own spouse. Do not ever give anyone else the power to appraise your worth. Your value is not determined by how useful you are to greedy people. You deserve to be surrounded by individuals who fiercely protect you when you are vulnerable, just like Sarah protected me. You deserve a life built on mutual respect and genuine care. Walking away from toxic relationships is incredibly painful, but staying and allowing them to completely consume your life is a tragedy. I learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to completely sever the ties that bind you to the people pulling you under. It is never too late to reclaim your power. You can always start over and build a beautiful, quiet, safe life on your own terms. If my journey resonated with you today, and if you agree that justice was served exactly how it should be, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to me, and it helps these important stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. I want to build a strong community where we can all find the courage to stand up for ourselves. Drop the word boundaries in the comments below if you stand with me. And I would really love to know what city are you watching from right now and exactly what time is it there. I read every single comment because connecting with you reminds me that we are never truly alone in our struggles. Thank you so much for listening to my story, for sharing your valuable time with me, and for believing in the power of the truth. I will see you in the next story. Please take good care.